Thank you all so very much for arriving so promptly. Thank you. If you could please take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, well, thank you all so very much for joining us this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're a little behind schedule already, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 50th anniversary of AACCLA and AACCLA's 50th meeting on the forecast for Latin America and the Caribbean. It is my pleasure to invite to the stage AACCLA's new chairman, Jose Antonio Munoz, who last night was passed the baton from our former chairman, Tom Kenna. So Jose Antonio, if I can, I'd like to invite you to come to this stage and address AACCLA, your organization. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all, distinguished guests, ambassadors, ladies, gentlemen. As Ruben mentioned, I am Jose Antonio Munoz, and I am the freshly minted chairman of the Association of American Chambers of Commerce in Latin America and the Caribbean, also and better known as AACCLA. I could not be more delighted and honored to be here with you this morning to open the 50th annual Forecast on Latin America and the Caribbean Conference. This is truly incredible. However, before we begin, on behalf of all of us in the AACCLA family, I want to offer our deep felt condolences to anyone that was injured or lost loved ones in yesterday's earthquake in Mexico, as well as the recent storms in Texas, the Caribbean, and Florida. These are truly trying times, and whilst I count myself lucky to be part of this great AACCLA network and family. To that end, I'd like to start by thanking Jody Hanson-Bond and the entire AACCLA Secretariat based here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for assuming the leading role in organizing this event. I'd also like to offer special thanks on behalf of AACCLA to the AACCLA Leadership Circle, whose advice, counsel, and support have helped define and advance the most important issues facing our region and across our region. With us here today are Leadership Circle representatives from TransUnion, DHL, ConocoPhillips, Delta Airlines, PriceSmart, Square Patton Boggs, Campbell Soup Company, Cargill, GE, Merck, and Federal Express. Thank you all very much. For half a century, the American Chambers of Commerce in Latin America and the Caribbean have been the most influential voice of U.S. business in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, joined together under AACCLA, these 24 AmChams represent nearly 20,000 companies and close to 80% of U.S. investment in the region. Acting in partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the world's largest business federation with over 3 million members, AACCLA has become an unrivaled advocate for U.S. business in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as here in Washington, D.C. But it has not always been that way. In fact, I think it is important to remember why AACCLA came into being 50 years ago and the mission that it has endeavored since that time. In the early 1960s, the future of American business in Latin America was precarious, and in some geographical areas, it was desperate. Fidel Castro was riding very high, and his personal appearances in places like Caracas ignited the dormant hostilities to U.S. influence and U.S. companies. The result was sabotage, terror, and the beginning of the guerrilla movement. In response to this threat, American business assumed an active role to counter the menace of communism and nationalism in order to create a fresh and dynamic image of U.S. business. In November 1966, David Rockefeller invited the presidents of major AmChams, American Chambers of Commerce, from across the region to discuss the formation of an intercontinental chamber to represent American business in all of Latin America. A meeting sponsored by Mr. Rockefeller was held in New Jersey, and was attended by 27 business leaders from the major Latin American countries. And following visits to every AmCham in the region, the AmCham leaders from 6 AmChams gathered in Caracas in 1967 and launched the network that I'm privileged to chair today. Since that first meeting 50 years ago, the AACCLA network has actively endeavored to promote trade and investment between the United States and the countries of the region through free trade, free markets, free enterprise, and the ideal of open societies. Thanks to the visionary work of individuals like David Rockefeller, William Waldrop, and Harry Freeman, today, Latin America and the Caribbean represent 1/5 of the United States' total foreign trade, and roughly 1/3 of all foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean originates from the United States. Together, not only do we support millions of jobs across the hemisphere, but the unbroken chain of free trade agreements stretching from Canada to Chile demonstrates our region's commitment to open, rule-based, multilateral trading systems. Throughout the 50 years of AACCLA, we have actively promoted these ideals because we know that adhering to the rule of law and advancing trade liberalization are the most effective means to providing economic prosperity for all. These ideals have been at the heart of U.S. trade policy and U.S. leadership in global trade policy. Today, that leadership appears to be in question. While the tremendous potential for our region remains, the domestic outlook will only start to be more promising when challenges facing the contracting economies have been resolved. There is no greater domestic challenge than the political attitudes here in the United States and across the hemisphere towards the prospects for new trade openings in the coming years. That is why we have gathered here today. As we look across the horizon at the next 50 years of AACCLA, what is it that we most endeavor to achieve? How can we, using this network of 24 AmChams, come together and unite this region under one common agenda of creating prosperity for all? And what is that agenda? Well, to answer those questions, I'm excited to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Jody Hanson-Bond, who will present the results of AACCLA's 50th anniversary Business Pulse survey. As most of you know, Jody serves as the Senior Vice President of the Americas at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Her portfolio includes executive management of the U.S.-Argentina Business Council, the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, the U.S.-Mexico Economic Council, and AACCLA, as well as the President's U.S.-Colombia and U.S.-Cuba Business Council. That is a lot of councils. Prior to joining the Chamber, Judy was Vice President of Global Government Relations and Country Management for the Motorola Corporation. Before that, she was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy and held positions with the law firms of Hopkins & Sutter and Foley & Lardner, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Washington State House of Representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jody Hanson-Bond.
Good morning. Thank you, Jose Antonio, so much. It's going to be such a pleasure to work with you as chairman of this organization in the coming year, especially in light of the results of the study that I'll be talking about today. I also want to thank Tom Kenna. It has been such a joy to work with you as the chairman of our organization, and we're just grateful for your leadership. I'm also thankful to everyone who is here today from the AACCLA family who's participated in something that really is the bedrock of what it is that we do as an organization. We need to understand what the pulse is of the hemisphere in order to create a strategy so that we can look at the next 50 years and what it is we're going to be doing in the coming year and the coming years in terms of our engagement. Many of you know that this Business Pulse survey has been the preeminent survey that helps define the direction of the organization because it gives us clarity on the policy priorities that are of concern and of opportunity for the organization overall, and it gives us a basic roadmap. So I'm going to go ahead and we are going to walk through this. We give you some visuals as well as a little bit of interpretation so that we can stay awake through the next 20 minutes of this presentation. But a quick overview of some of the facts and participants is we had 3 objectives here. The first aim of the study was to better understand the priorities of our hemispheric AmChams and you, the business leaders. Second, the survey allows us to better comprehend the regional challenges our members are confronting. And third, the results allow us to drill down and uncover areas for potential opportunity or growth, as I said. In terms of participation, by presenting the survey in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, we were extremely pleased that we had over 600 executives from our AACCLA network of 24 chambers in 28 countries that contributed to the study. And the very first question that we asked is, what are the, that's the overview. The very first question we asked is, what's the most important issue to address in the region? And I think that given the survey studied we had 7 different key areas that we looked at: trade facilitation, intellectual property and innovation, contribution to U.S. business, rule of law, cross-border data flows, and healthcare. And what you'll see in this slide is a reoccurring theme that we're going to be talking about today at this conference, and that is that far and above, that the primary issue that was on your minds and of concern to business leaders was rule of law. That this is an area that we need to drill down and address as an institution moving forward. Because all of the respondents highlighted rule of law as the #1 issue impacting the region, of course, with around 35% of the respondents from both the Andean region and Central America having an increasing response to the need to tackle this issue. And that's not to dismiss other categories that were discussed, because clearly trade facilitation registered high on the need to be addressed. But I think the core takeaway from this slide is the importance of rule of law, and it's understandable that it's a challenge to find a country in our region that is not currently confronting rule of law challenges in some fashion. We next asked all survey participants to provide some input on what their opinions are over the next 4 years of looking at the region. I absolutely love this slide because the smiley faces or the sad faces, they've got mustaches on them. What is that about? Anyhow, just a little commentary early morning, but look, the mustaches will show you, the faces, that because AACCLA stakeholders are genuinely positive people overall and a can-do bunch, that over half of our respondents were either optimistic or very optimistic about what they see over the next 4 years, what the next 4 years holds for them. And this was especially true of the respondents from the Southern Cone. Literally, almost 66% of those respondents are very optimistic about the prospects for the Southern Cone. I think one potential hypothesis for this is that we now see, for the first time in decades, a group of Southern Cone governments, including Brazil, despite dealing with a political crisis, that largely embrace free market principles and more integrated regional and global trade ties. The next question, moving on from the mustache, happy face one, that we asked is, what about GDP? What about economic growth? What do we see? What do our members see, and what are you forecasting over the same 4-year horizon? And I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that regional growth, the respondents, about 35% of which indicated that they see regional growth to be somewhere in the 2 to 4% range, which basically is in line with what most economists are projecting for the region. About 30% of the respondents also estimated growth would continue its sluggishness in the 2% range. And note that on this chart, there are 2 outliner graphics. First, that 42% of Central Americans believe the region actually could achieve a little more, which is in the 4 to 6% growth range. However, I don't think it's much of a surprise that Central America has tended to outgrow the rest of the region in recent years. And second, that 42% of Andean respondents believe that GDP growth over the next 4 years will be negative in the 2 to 4% range. The result begs some further investigation and hypothesis, but while growth is undoubtedly sluggish in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, one could guess that once-in-a-century economic depression in Venezuela, which has seen annual growth contract by about 10%, could be at work in explaining this decidedly negative projection. So we then, moving on, we then asked our respondents to weigh in on key short-term. What are the immediate reforms they think could translate into economic growth? And sticking to the reoccurring theme that I mentioned earlier is that strengthening rule of law and fighting corruption was the key short-term reform that 45% of our hemispheric respondents believe could really drive growth. The next highest category of the 8 measured was reducing or simplifying taxes. You know, it's funny, I had a bunch of members here from Brazil yesterday, and along party lines, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee and some of the others from Brazil, they are taking tax reform so seriously as one of the most critical issues that needs to be addressed for Brazil to have any growth and attract the investment even amidst the crisis right now. So reducing or simplifying taxes, key importance to our business leaders. But my takeaway from this slide basically is that when 45% of the respondents identify rule of law as the single most important area needed for enhancing reform, and another 55% of our respondents are split between 7 categories, with the next highest only registering at 17%, the governments and business communities need to make rule of law a priority. And let me just add that based on these survey results, we very much welcome this issue being the topic of next year's Summit of the Americas, and we actually are going to discuss that later today when we not only have a panel on rule of law, but when we have the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Luis Alberto Moreno, here. We're going to be talking about it. Going on to slide 7, we asked about short-term reforms that could trigger growth in the last question, so now we're going to talk about growth-enhancing long-term reforms. And once again, we not surprisingly see that rule of law is the number one long-term area of reform that could drive growth based on 32% of the respondents, making it the highest ranking. But I think one of the most interesting result answers to this question is how high, quote, improving public education ranked in this long-term outlook. And clearly, intellectual capital and the capacity of the workforce development is a key issue to our member companies around the world. But this issue ranked very high, and so it's one we'll continue to focus on. Improving the quality of education and is really a means to driving growth and increasing competitiveness in this global economy. So we and you are already working on workforce development challenges in the region, given there are only 12 universities in Latin America and the Caribbean that ranked in the global top 500 universities. I don't think that doubling down in this area is a real surprise to anyone. Next, I would like to examine a few issues that are priority areas to AACCLA stakeholders and a few key business areas. So let's talk about intellectual property. In asking whether or not there is a sufficient enough understanding of the importance of IP among regional governments, regulators, and the general public, nearly half, or 48% of the respondents said there is not a focus on IP. And to us in the business community, protection and enforcement of intellectual property is obviously integral to growing our businesses and innovating. And the results of the study question would indicate we've got a lot more work to do on educating all of our stakeholders on the importance of IP in general. For us, I think we need to know that unfortunately for too long our countries have ranked in the bottom third of the Global Intellectual Property Center's annual IP index, and we actually look forward to teaming and partnering with them to address this further challenge. Next, we asked questions about the nature of customs laws. Maritza, are you watching? There we go. The nature of customs laws, and I'm going to call on people just to see if you're all awake and following your area in Latin America and the Caribbean. And unfortunately, less than 9% of respondents believe that customs laws and procedures are appropriate for the flow of goods and services and the capabilities of growth that would lead to greater economic opportunities. A whopping 91% of those surveyed believe that customs regulations are either inconsistently applied, inadequate to meet the dual need of making commerce flow be more secure and more efficient. And despite changing tides in the Southern Cone, this is especially true there, where nearly 1 in 4 respondents indicated to us that the laws are overly restrictive. So then returning to the theme of rule of law, when we asked respondents to characterize the state of investor protection in the region, only 36% of our respondents actually responded. Sorry, I didn't move the slide forward. Let's move to rule of law. 36% of our respondents perceived them as strong and adequate, or at least improving, that there's an operating environment that would lend itself to improving or strengthening the institutions if we work with them. Unfortunately, of course, 64% said that investor protections in the context of rule of law are either deteriorating or poor. But this is why we are involved right now in a NAFTA renegotiation, for example, and the private sector is so adamant about ensuring that not only do we keep our investor-state dispute settlement, which is ISDS, in our free trade agreements, but we need to actually enhance the ISDS when and wherever possible. This is why. However, knowing the rule of law is an issue, it's only really the start of the conversation. So we asked, what are the important steps that can be taken to reduce corruption and strengthen the rule of law. So 73% of our participants actually responded. They chose 2 categories among a total of 9 that were considered. First, 42% of total survey respondents indicated that stronger democratic institutions and, no surprise, independent judiciaries are paramount, with more than half of the Andean region believing this to be the case. One might draw the logical conclusion that Venezuela may be playing an outsized role here too, but literally only 31% of AACCLA stakeholders surveyed believe that greater transparency and accountability in our public institutions is the most important factor in reducing corruption and strengthening rule of law, with the Caribbean seeing this as literally the most important factor for the region. I'm going to move on to slide 12. So what is the key issue right now influencing the region? Just a minute, let me. As we look beyond the 4-year horizon that has shaped so many of the questions up until now, and we're trying to drill down on what our stakeholders see as the influentials, you'll see why surveyed on 6 key themes and we asked respondents to actually write in. Some of you, some of these 600 gave responses that were written in, and once again, weak institutions and corruption is predominantly part of the challenge here. Do you know what slide I'm on, Ruben? Isn't that funny? I feel like my slides got screwed up here. So it's okay. Sorry, I don't have my slides numbered, so I'm. What's that? Go back to. There we go. Okay. So, but we do have a number of issues that are crossover issues that are all tied to the same framework of the operating environment and its challenges. I think that the fact that education surveyed first among Southern Cone participants as 34% of them, as you can see up there, as one of the most important issues to countries like Kathy, Chile, and of course Argentina, is something that we're taking into account, as I mentioned and talked about education a few minutes ago. But not to be ignored is the 15% of respondents who believe that the trajectory of gang violence is a key factor that needs to be addressed in influencing the business operating environment of the region, and a vital concern to all of our AACCLA stakeholders across the region, not just literally limited to the Northern Triangle issues. Moving on to the next slide, I think I'm back on track here. In the next several slides, and I think we only have 5 more, is that we look at options across the region toward the U.S., beginning with this question that examines the perceptions across the region toward the United States. We're taking a quick look at ourselves here and the United States government. And we need to potentially adjust this research on this one, since we're surveying our AmCham leaders. You guys probably have more favorable view here, but that's okay. There's a little bit of bias, but we're heartened to see that 72% of the respondents had a favorable view of the United States private sector and of U.S. investment. So that's a very high number in terms of looking at U.S. investors, and we should take heart of that. Perhaps reflective of the current uncertainty surrounding trade and investment policy, however, of the new U.S. administration. Let's talk about it, the elephant in the room. And the favorability rating of the United States then drops to 38%, with an accompanying 30% unfavorable rating. Despite that unfavorable view, and perhaps yet again reflective of the optimism of the can-do spirit of the AACCLA stakeholders, 47% of our respondents are, again, optimistic or very optimistic about the future of relations with the United States and the Caribbean. And with only 20% being pessimistic. A takeaway from this set of results could actually be that AACCLA stakeholders are looking past any short-term uncertainty with regard to the United States' role in the region and are focused heavily on strong ties that the United States has maintained for decades with countries across the region and believing this will be the norm in the long term. As you'll see to the right, however, the interesting piece of this is that Central American leaders are the most optimistic, actually, about the future relations with the United States. And maybe I think this is due to the fact that AACCLA, the U.S. Chamber, and the Inter-American Development Bank partnered with the U.S., Mexican, and Colombian governments to host a Central American Forum in Miami. And at that event, there were numerous U.S. cabinet officials, including Vice President Pence, that really put some emphasis and importance on the real issue of challenge, of informality being the root of the problem. I think we all were trying to highlight where do the challenges lie and how can we actually be helpful. And I'm grateful we had participation and interactions not only with Vice President Pence, but with Secretary Tillerson and with the Treasury Secretary and the State Department, General John Kelly, Department of Homeland Security. Then he's the new Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. But I think it was heartening to see this focus because it's not easy to forget that the first foreign visit or discussion or topic matter of a U.S. cabinet official was to Central America, so we all take heart there. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of identifying policies that should be the top regional priorities for the United States president, staying back on ourselves here, nearly 35% of all that were surveyed believe that free trade and economic integration should be the top of President Trump's list. How about that for a message to send? That begs the question for whether the uncertainties surrounding the regional and global trade policies of this administration is provoking this response. And so this is an area for further discussion and study. In other areas, AACCLA leaders and stakeholders believe that priorities for President Trump should include first, policies that foster increased economic mobility and inclusion. Next, that strengthening security and combating violence and narco-trafficking should be a priority. And third, strengthening democracy and the rule of law. Given the prior survey responses, we've seen finding that strengthening democracy and rule of law checks in just fourth on the list of our stakeholders' top regional priorities for President Trump. This maybe seems counterintuitive, but to us it's actually consistent with the feedback we get from all of our AmChams. They want their own governments to be responsible for improving democracy and rule of law, rather than relying on foreign governments or any other entity to do it. So if we move on to slide 16, in terms of confidence that AACCLA stakeholders have for the United States to deal capably with challenges in the region, our results here are decidedly mixed. It's a 50-50 split. 50% of the respondents feel a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the United States, while 50% have zero confidence in us. How about that? Right down the middle. Next, we asked, I think I might take a quick second, though, that the response is different across the hemisphere. It really does vary quite a bit. In the Andean region, where we're really witnessing the devastating realities of Venezuela unfold, And in that particular case, 62% of the respondents said they had little confidence. But in Central America, once again, where you have seen more coordinated response or collaborative response across Mesoamerica, with the U.S. leading a lot of the engagement, the confidence jumps up to 60%. So the next slide is talking about our stakeholders' opinions in the December 2014 rapprochement between the United States and Cuba, as the issue has long been a source of division between the United States and many countries in the region. And respondents of our survey, overwhelmingly to the tune of 94%. That's, I mean, think about that, 94%. Either somewhat approve or strongly approve of the restoration of diplomatic ties between the two countries. It's a perspective that AACCLA would advise the Trump administration to take into account when it considers placing new restrictions on U.S. travel and trade tied with Cuba. And of course, we've been vocal in this regard. If you move to slide, one of the final few slides, in the next couple slides, we're going to look at a couple opinions across the region toward more specific challenges our companies are facing in the region. And with the first question, we asked stakeholders to consider 10 factors and identify the biggest external obstacles to business profitability. The point is that we actually have to run businesses. You have to run businesses in the region, and you need them to be profitable. And that profitability actually creates the tax revenue for the social programs that go into these countries. So once again, the rule of law themes, again, is a theme prominently, with weak and insufficient public institutions topping the list, with nearly 15% of the respondents making it the biggest obstacle in corruption, ranking third, with 12% of respondents considering it the biggest impediment to profitability. Perhaps the most interesting sub-regional result was tied to political instability. While less than 8% of the general region ranked it number one, nearly 29% of the Southern Cone respondents considered it the biggest obstacle, likely a reflection, of course, of the ongoing political turmoil in Brazil and potentially lurking influence of Kirchnerismo in Argentina. But moving on to the next slide is the sector most likely to attract investment in the next 12 months in the region, as we are asking our stakeholders, oops, I've got a little bit of a issue here, as we're asking our stakeholders which categories are going to be reflective of increased growth capabilities in the region. I think you look at mining in the Andean region, we see it crossed or spread over several categories, including tourism, energy, infrastructure, technology, and telecommunications and manufacturing coming in a little lower. But in the Caribbean, you of course see that, or the Caribbean, you see tourism and energy topping that list. So that's very interesting to us because it shows us which sectors are going to be doubling down and where we're going to be looking. We also asked, because startups are really the lifeblood of the entrepreneurship capabilities, are what create the pipeline for new growth and for innovation to occur. And we attempted to look at the receptivity of regional markets to entrepreneurship by asking AACCLA stakeholders in what part of the business is a startup likely to encounter the most obstacles. And look at that, a number of procedures obtaining to permitting and licensing and all of this. This is literally, I mean, this is almost 40% of what is, you know, not surprisingly, even in the United States, part of a challenge for any small business entrepreneur or medium-sized business trying to grow an SME. Nearly 39%, of course, said red tape. So Our familiar foe of also rule of law comes up in addition to higher costs for startups were cited as barriers to trade. Taking into account now all of these factors that we've discussed associated with free trade and with economic integration as a whole, we asked stakeholders to identify the country in the region that's demonstrated the most leadership on trade in the promotion of free enterprise. And it probably won't surprise anyone that 28% of the respondents picked Chile. Oftentimes our businesses say, if you were a small business and you were trying to actually enter into Latin America, Chile seems to be a very good first start. But with more than literally 60 free trade agreements, including the US-Chile FTA, it's the leadership role in a geopolitical context in terms of an economic context of the Pacific Alliance and the leading efforts of the remaining 11 Trans-Pacific Partnership countries to retrieve the government back into this alliance. There's no question that Chile is just, look, a bona fide pro-trade country that's attractive to our member companies. It also, not surprisingly, therefore, tops the list of countries whereby the rule of law and transparency in our indices that we've looked at in our studies as one of the easiest markets to navigate. Ranking 2 and 3, respectively, are Mexico, thank you, and Panama, which each boast literally dozens of bilateral trade agreements. No surprise, trade agreements, rule of law. Trade agreements, rule of law, operating environment, and certainty for our investors, for your companies. And literally these countries you have all said that they've got the most business-friendly economic reform agendas, hands down. Okay, it is that time where I am wrapping up and I am getting to the final slide of the Business Pulse survey. So speaking of Mexico, AACCLA stakeholders see the current renegotiation of NAFTA 2.0 as potentially providing the best chance of enhancing regional integration. And I say that with a caveat for all the respondents, that it's got to be done right. It's first, we can't lose the existing trade agreement. We need it. And we need it, if it is modified, that it is modified and modernized, and that will serve as a platform. Reasons for this response could be many, but our communication with our members leads us to believe that regional AACCLA members believe that a successful resolution to NAFTA 2.0 can literally only lead to improved trade relations and to deepening integration between the United States and to the region more broadly. Notable, though, I did want to say that the survey respondents believe that CARICOM could play also an incredibly important role in the Caribbean region, and respondents likewise see the Pacific Alliance. Sometimes it's referenced as a successor to TPP, if you will, and Mercosur, that it is evolving as increasingly the reform-minded platform that that leaders in Argentina and Brazil are migrating toward and embracing as potentially one of the more important platforms of enhancing regional integration. So this concludes our Business Pulse survey, and I especially want to thank the over 600 leaders, business leaders who helped contribute to this, the stakeholders who took part of it. You literally were candid, and this is how we inform ourselves, and this is how we inform our communication with our government and with governments overseas to set the foundation and set our policy priorities as we embark upon the next half century of AACCLA's leadership in this hemisphere. The results that we have gleaned that AACCLA literally AACCLA's 7 existing policy areas should indeed be priority areas of focus for the regional business community. And it's really led us to the next steps in planning that we're reviewing with our AACCLA members over the course of the week. I did want to note as we go into the next session that this is one example of what we're doing into action as a result of the survey is that our recently completed global index for the rule of law, which Kendra and others will be previewing later today. It'll be debuting later this fall. And when we actually started this index covering Latin America and the Caribbean, we started with a small batch and then we grew it to look at 60 countries in the operating environment for business. So stay tuned to more information. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time and attention early morning for reviewing your results today. Now, as is totally and completely appropriate in terms of a segue, we're going to have a corporate panel talking about the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you so much. And I know there's a lot of questions about the survey itself. We'll be sending out the survey results to everybody so you have access not only to the presentation, to the results itself. And I think as Jody emphasized throughout that entire presentation, rule of law clearly continues to be the #1 priority. It has been over the decade that we've been doing this survey and clearly is reinforced there. And as Jody mentioned, what better transition to have than to have our next panel be fully focused on the rule of law and what we can do from the private sector. So I'd like to invite Kendra Gaither, the Senior Director for the Americas, to come to the stage, as well as with Rick Johnston, Ralph Ives, and Dr. Jean-Michel Urige. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I believe Jody gave us a great context from which to begin this conversation, so I'm just going to stand here at the mic for a brief moment as we get set up and get our panelists mic'd. But as you heard, the work that we're doing in the global rule of law context does come from this AACCLA community, and we're grateful to be able to share with you some of the results of our newly researched and soon to be finalized Global Business Rule of Law Dashboard for 2017. As Jody mentioned, it grew out of the region and really is a reflection of what our chamber stands for and what our AmCham stand for, which is really that free enterprise thrives when rule of law is promoted and constitutional protections for all are honored. You saw that reflected exactly in the survey results and how you all took to and really spotlighted this issue. So I'm delighted that we're going to have an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into what that means in a corporate context and what that means in the inter-American system with our distinguished panelists. So just to quickly get to the heart of the matter, I'll note that obviously in building this dashboard and building the work that we've done, we've built it upon the 5 factors that all of you have pointed to, and they were articulated equally well in the survey that really encompass why rule of law is so important for business and those factors that companies are looking for when making investment decisions. And so in collaboration with our Coalition for the Rule of Law in Global Markets that's here at the Chamber and working with our research partner, Pugat Concilium, we were able to develop a dashboard that draws on existing data and existing internationally recognized evaluations of the rule of law and really looks at very specific aspects of those surveys and indices to look at how this impacts the rule of law for business, most specifically. It really is truly a global measure. I'm pleased to report that in 2017, we are growing to 72 countries. You will note that the most prominent group of countries that you see presented are from the Americas. 26 of the 72 are from this region. It grows again from the interest and the initiative that this region took to launch the focus on the rule of law for business. And though you won't be able to see these results very clearly, I did want to note that we do have an evaluation that shows how the Americas stack up against these 72 markets that are really reflective of the fact that investment decisions are no longer made between a country that is neighboring another. It really is a global decision. And so in so doing, we've expanded from the initial 10 countries to 72, and really giving a better perspective of how the Americas ranks amongst its key peers and competitors in attracting investment and generating economic growth through a strong adherence to rule of law. I'll just quickly note that our 2017 dashboard, which you'll, as Jody noted, will come out in final later this fall. Three key things that emerged, which is that the rule of law remains a challenge globally. While we're talking about this in the Americas context, I do want to note that some of the results that you'll see for the Americas are not encouraging. I'll consider that a call to action for this community. It's an issue that is really a challenge globally. Second, you'll note that the West is not the best. In actuality, for the 72 countries who composed the survey, 4 of the top 5 were actually from Asia. And though the larger trend in terms of average numbers show that Europe is still leading as a block, Asia is trending a lot higher on the survey relative to other regions. And unfortunately, as you'll note in the third key finding, unfortunately, the Americas is falling a bit behind its peer regions. And in fact, 6 of the lowest spots on the rankings were occupied by countries in the Americas. Giving that a little bit more of a clear hemispheric picture, I do want to note that this is a tool that all of our AACCLA leaders will be able to use and our members will be able to use because it is reflective of the AmChams in the region and offers greater AACCLA coverage to be able to have the conversation about what's happening in our markets. Again, it's 30% of the global dashboard, so it really gives an opportunity to have not just a strong global conversation, but a great regional discussion too, one that we were going to engage in momentarily. I'll note that out of those 72 countries, as Jody alluded, Chile was one of the leaders in the region. Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica were the top markets from Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of scoring. And again, we did have still some room for growth at the bottom with more of those spots at the bottom occupied by the Americas. Just wanted to give you, again, a visual representation of where we started and where we've grown. In 2013, based on your input and the work of this coalition, we started only looking at the Americas and looking at 10 markets. And now we're looking at 26 and giving a much broader AACCLA coverage in terms of how we're evaluating how the Americas are doing as a region and how it's faring globally. And being able to do so, again, you won't be able to see quite the divergence, but in that 26 are reflected US and Canada, with Canada scoring highest in our region at a 78% ranking or evaluation amongst all the regressions that were done to produce the results. And there's a wide array of numbers with a grouping in the middle in that 40s to 50% range, with the lowest score being at 22% with our partners in Haiti. So again, some room to grow all across. The average score was 48 for the hemisphere. So we have some collective work to do as a community. But just rather than point to those stock numbers, because we do have a body of evaluation to look at over the 4 years that we've been producing this study, you can take a look at where are they now. The top markets in 2013 were Canada, US, Chile, Colombia, and Brazil. And you will note, unfortunately, that there is a downward trend even in the top part of our regional survey and our regional results. Canada and the US actually had the largest drop with 5% and 6% respectively in their rule of law ranking raw data over the 4-year period. And finally, the other 5 countries that composed our original 10 were Mexico, Argentina, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And again, showing a downward trend in these markets, those 10 original markets, which really is reflective of what we're seeing in the region. Now that I have literally brought the energy down by showing a decline in the rule of law, I do want to pick it up with an actionable conversation with some distinguished leaders. from the hemisphere, starting first with the great honor that we have with having the Secretary of Legal Affairs for the Organization of American States, Dr. Jean-Michel Arihi, to start us off by talking a little bit about what the Inter-American system is doing to promote all the issues that were raised today.
Thank you, and thanks to invite me that meeting. The Secretary General was unable to come. He's out of town, and he asked me to represent the organization. Taking into account the first presentation, I am on the optimistic people about this issue, and I will give you a few reasons. Our organization was created in 1889 to develop the rule of law, the inter-American rule of law, and the creation of institutions. And that was very successful. If you see all the institutions created by the organization, including banks, a health organization, children organization, and a lot of treaties that give as a result that during the 20th century, the inter-American region from Canada to Argentina and Chile was the most peaceful region in the world. I always put an example that I give early in the morning. If you compare the map of the Americas of 1889 with the map of the Americas today, it's the same. If you do the same exercise with the map of Europe, for instance, 1889 you have Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, etc. Then you have two German states, Yugoslavia, URSS, etc. Now you have, etc., etc. In all the changes in the map of Europe, you have millions of people who died. That doesn't happen in the Americas. International rule of law works very well. We were also the first region to mix something that doesn't happen yet at the universal level and in other regions too. International law, defense of democracy, protection of human rights, and then after 1996, the fight against corruption. That's something we mix in the region. First was the relation between inter-American law and human rights, then democracy, and then fighting against corruption. All those were very difficult because, as you know, one of the principles that our countries are very proud is the principle of non-intervention and fighting against corruption. Talking about kind of governments by an international organization was seen as a violation of the principle of non-intervention. But we agree. In 1994, in the first summit of the Americas, the Chief of State of the Americas proposed to fight against corruption and to have a convention about that. At that time, I was also the director. I am for more than 20 years responsible of the treaties in the Americas. I was very pessimistic. I said the principle of non-intervention, we will have a convention, nobody will ratify the convention. I made a big mistake. The convention was approved, but not only was approved, is the convention who was ratified by all the states of the Americas, from Canada to Argentina and Chile, all the Caribbean countries, except one. It's Barbados. I don't know why, but Barbados doesn't ratify the convention. But not only that, because you can have a lot of convention without implementation. That is easy to have a convention. But on the summit of Quebec in 2001, the Chief of State gave us to the OAS two mandates. One, to create a mechanism for the follow-up of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, and second, to have a democratic charter, not only as the rules that we have from the 90s to fight against coup d'etat, but also to protect other aspects of democracy. That include freedom of expression, access to information, transparency, independence of the judiciary power, free elections. That was a mandate from the Chief of State in 2001, and then in 2001, we created the mechanism for the follow-up of the Convention Against Corruption, and we approved the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And you know that that charter was used in many cases, in Nicaragua, in Ecuador, in Honduras, and now we are trying to do something, if we can, in Venezuela. But we create the mechanism for the follow-up of the Convention Against Corruption. And I hope you can check on the web page, we have an anti-corruption portal of the Americas, where we have all the information about all the member states, all the 34 member states of the OAS, all the law, and also the evaluation made by the other member states of the accomplishment, how they need to improve the rule of law, how they need to improve the organization of their institution. And now we have a third mechanism, that is the visit in situ, to see if what they said it's correspond to the through, and then we have meeting with private sector, with judiciary, with parliaments, with civil society, etc. During the evaluation of the member state, also we receive the reports of the civil society. That is on the international point of view. But now we know that we need to work on the rule of law in the internal law. And we are more and more engaged in the preparation of model law to improve the national legislation. One case was the model law on access to information. That was a request from the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And that improved the national legislation in many countries of the Americas. Also, we have in the Commission of Human Rights the rapporteur for freedom of expression. Those are issues that are very linked with the fight against corruption. Without transparency, without access to information, without democracy, without separation of judiciary power, we don't have the mechanism to fight against corruption. And my message is that, and we are in particular cases, and I'm talking the case, for instance, in Honduras, we are developing a more strong presence. In other countries, we are working more on electoral observation. In other countries, on freedom. If you think, and I give you why I am optimistic. Between 90 and 1990, in the Americas, we have 180 coup d'etat, military coup d'etat, military coup d'etat. From 1990, that was the first decision to sanction a member state where was a coup d'etat. From 1990 to now, we only have 3 military coup d'etat in the Americas. That is a big change. That is a big change. The same on the approval of law on transparency. We have to make a lot of things, but That's something that we need to work together, because more and more is not an issue of inter-American law, it's more and more an issue of national law and on implementation at the national level. We have the broad picture. Now we need to work at the national level. And we cannot work at the national level only with the executive power. That is our natural counterpart. We need to work with both of you. And that's why I am very happy to be with you, and I know that we can begin to work more and more joint task. Thank you.
Thank you. That's certainly a very welcome message from this audience, and we're certainly going to avail ourselves of that opportunity that you've presented to us. I do want to start with the fact that you've set the table in terms of how the OAS and how the inter-American system is, through peer review and other things, really holding member states to account and accounting upon us to help be part of that process. I'd like to drill down to how the private sector is engaging in that, first starting with Rick and working my way over to Ralph, getting closer and closer to me. Rick, if you wouldn't mind picking up a little bit of that thread of the public sector engagement and telling us how City promotes these key tenets of the rule of law for business, both with its public sector clients, but as importantly with its private sector clients.
Okay, thank you, Kendra, and want to express my deep appreciation for you inviting me to be part of this. It's such an incredibly important topic, and thanks to Jody and her team. You guys do a fabulous job for us. I really appreciate it. Number one, I have to say I am deeply impressed by the fact we're here on the 50th anniversary of AACLA. I always get it, all the letters right. You know, we talk about the need for institutional sustainability and all of that, but this is really an impressive organization when you think about 50 years of this and hanging in there, and obviously as a business enterprise. I can't think of a more powerful, frankly, more powerful institution from the private sector point of view than an AACLA. And I think we all of us need to collectively have to continue to sustain and encourage this organization perhaps more than any other, particularly in this rule of law issue. I also want to make some observations, a couple of brief observations about City, because it does go to our commitment to the region and also, very importantly, to this topic. Jane Frazier, some of you probably know, she is our CEO for Latin America and is very active in a lot of the programs that Jody's running now here at the Chamber. But she is really demonstrating some amazing leadership for us at City in the Latin American region. Amongst other things, paying much more close attention to the rule of law question. Obviously for City, we've been, OAS is pretty old. We were started in 1812. I hate to say during the war, but we were started during the War of 1812. And since then, we've established a presence in over 100 countries. But important to today's conversation, we have a presence in 23 countries. And we, as you can imagine, being a very large bank, also sadly become the target of a lot of litigation, mainly because of, one, its deep pockets, which sadly is not unique to the Americas, but it's a fact. And the perception that, oh, well, you know, once the City entity is drawn in and some of the officers are drawn in, we'll settle. And I want to go on record right now, for you and the world, we don't settle. We're going to fight. If we feel that there is something that is not going properly, there's not a following of due process, if there's corruption involved, you're going to have a fight on your hands, and I want to put everybody on notice on that one. Because we believe that we have also a responsibility, not just to our shareholders and to our company, but to our clients and to the business community and the governments writ large, to have faith in and to use the rule of law in order to enforce rights and protect rights. I did a brief survey of our legal department. I work very closely with our legal department. I'm a reforming lawyer for 35 years of practice here in Washington. When I was then asked by Citi to start their International Government Affairs program. And so I work a lot with our legal department, as you can imagine, in Latin America. A lot of the issues that come back here for me to attend to are problems involving corruption, where the hope is that by use of our good ties with the U.S. government, we can draw attention to problems that arise in some of these more problematic markets, and perhaps by showing a light on the process and what is happening, having an effect that I like to call it driving the cockroaches to the corners. Because it does have that effect, and it's been our experience that when we've drawn attention to what we know to be particularly corrupt activity, it does have a salutary effect and does tend to suppress, doesn't always eradicate, the element of corruption that creeps into particularly due process. I fully agree with all the points about where improvements are necessary, but obviously for us, corruption is a key point. And of course, Kendra and I have been working for a couple of years now on things involving Interpol, where there's an abuse of the Interpol system of red listing. This goes to perhaps one of our more favorite themes within Citi, and that is the filing of a civil complaint by a complainant that's decided, this is the deep pocket syndrome, or it can sometimes the best defense is an aggressive offense. But what we find is that too often within many of these jurisdictions, the complainant will file a civil suit and then persuade the prosecutor to add on a criminal charge of fraud, thereby allowing for the prosecutor's office to obtain arrest warrants that can be given to Interpol, and thereby restraining movement of our senior officials across borders because of the red listing. It's an abuse. It's something it's pretty well known nowadays, and I think we're having a salutary effect on trying to have Interpol pay attention to how that process is being abused. And again, you'll hear me say the word process over and over again because that's where we find real problems. I think, too, the other thing that we need to recognize, and then I'll be quiet, is the role media plays in this. Again, it's the transparency point. It's a very good one. But we have found that while we can hire the best lawyers in any given jurisdiction, if you're dealing with corruption, no matter how much you abide by the rule of law within the proceeding, that's actually not going to work to your benefit, because if you are dealing with corrupt officials, whether prosecutors, judges, or politicians, they're manipulating the system. They're manipulating the process. And if you're trying to play by the rules, you're obviously playing by the rules with a severe handicap. So one of the things we have found, again, is in the context of transparency, is to work very effectively with media. And I would say to you that in this conversation about how to deal with it, I know this is not lawyerly, but from practicing law here in Washington, there is always in issue advocacy a lot of different components to a solution. And I would say that in our wrestling with rule of law and trying to improve upon its application within many of these markets where corruption particularly is a problem, the media plays a huge role and can play a huge role. And I think as we address these issues within AACLA, really should be maybe upping our game in how we're working with media on this particular topic.
Thank you for that, Rick. And as an economist, I'm happy that we're talking about how we can do this in a non-lawyerly way to really bring a spotlight. I'd like to turn to Ralph, because you're in a unique position, Ralph, representing the Medical Devices Technology Association. If you would tell us a little bit about your work with AdvaMed and sort of the unique perspective or initiative that the association has undertaken to really promote key tenets of rule of law for business through your work in promoting regulatory coherence around the region.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Kendra, for inviting me, and Jody, and Tom, and others. It's a pleasure for me to be back at AACCLA, and I say that because when I was at USTR, I worked in the Americas section. I was part of the first Summit of the Americas and promoting the FTAA, and we won't address how that came out, but I did appreciate very much the support that we at USTR got from AACCLA, so it's a real pleasure to be back with you. And let me do a very brief commercial message about the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AVAMed, where I work. Our manufacturers make the full range of medical technology products, from very simple things like tongue depressors, stethoscopes, all the way up to the more advanced technology, implants, pacemakers, artificial hearts, big machines, MRIs, et cetera. And they basically everything in the hospital except the pills and the people. And members operate, either sell or invest throughout Latin America, so they're very, and the world. And just as, I guess you're a substitute for somebody, I'm a substitute for Stephen Bipes. Many of you may have met and worked with Stephen. He heads the Americas part of my office at AVAMed. Stephen is now in Ottawa practicing what I'll be preaching. He is up in Ottawa with the governments and industry representatives of 23 countries talking about and addressing regulatory convergence and coherence. And I'm sure it's pretty easy, the term convergence, basically looking at best practices, best regulatory practices, and trying to get governments to converge on those best practices. Coherence, meaning basically a set of across the spectrum rules that provide a foundation for good regulatory practices in terms of stability, predictability, transparency, some of the concepts that others talked about. And let me very briefly discuss how these concepts come together for our industry. And let me do it by citing 4 numbers: 5, 10, 20, and 15. And 5% is the average global tariff for all products around the world. And it's as a former trade negotiator, that's what a lot of our time is spent, looking at those tariffs and trying to bring them down. 10% is the tariff equivalent of customs duties and efficiencies globally. 20% is the tariff equivalent of non-tariff technical barriers to trade globally. And at least 15%, and probably higher, is the additional cost of products and services in the region due to unethical practices and corruption. And addressing these is possible by implementing the Trade Facilitation Agreement in the WTO. That would eliminate customs inefficiencies. Regulatory convergence to eliminate regulatory differences, not the regulations, the differences. And anti-corruption efforts to eliminate illegal and unethical business practices. If, over the years, the governments and industry address these 3 areas, and these 3 areas are not those evil trade agreement areas that some people talk about. These are basically domestic policies. You could achieve the tariff equivalent of about a 40% elimination in tariffs. And these are savings that can be passed on to patients. And patients is what our members really focus on. And there are existing fora to address these issues. As I said, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement could help eliminate barriers on savings and importation. There's a group called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which is a successor to the Global Harmonization Task Force, as a way to address regulatory convergence in medical devices. And medical technology associations in Latin America, Europe, Asia are coming together to develop a common set of ethical business practices, a harmonized code of conduct in our dealings between hospital healthcare providers and our industry. It has to be a very close relationship, but we want to make sure that those interactions are done in an ethically sound way. And finally, AVAMed is very pleased to work in conjunction with the Chamber Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation. the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center, and the American National Standards Institute to develop what is now the baseline reference document for regulatory coherence globally. These are AdvaMed's priorities in terms of the rule of law in the Americas. We hope that this can also be a focus for AACCLA, U.S. Chamber, AmChams, and governments in the region. As an important step, we've gained the consensus of the Regulatory Working Group of the Americas Business Dialogue, ABD, to seek full ABD endorsement at their October meeting, to have the Summit of the Americas CEOs and leaders support adoption of regulatory coherence as policies across the Americas. It would be great if we could achieve similar initiatives and similar support on trade facilitation and anti-corruption. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to pick up on something that I feel like came out of each of your comments in some way. First, I'll note that all of them talked about hemispheric initiatives in the broader sense, the Inter-American system through the OAS. We had a shout out to the Americas Business Dialogue and our work with the Inter-American Development Bank on that, and obviously I work on AACCLA as a hemispheric body. In each of the cases where we talked about rule of law, in some instance, each of you brought up an example of a challenge of corruption, be it through customs that could be eliminated through trade facilitation, through bribery mechanisms that often companies find themselves in when faced with a due process issue, and obviously in the table setting in terms of putting in place conventions that mitigate corruption. How do you see that trend evolving from looking at the symptoms of corruption in these spaces to how we can better help put in place or advocate, use our perches to advocate for going beyond the challenges of corruption to how this translates in a much bigger picture, a bigger inter-American system? I throw that open. I know that's a little bit off script, but given that we've talked so much about corruption and it is a symptom of weak rule of law systems, as we saw in the surveys, is there something that you feel that we should be doing better as a business community to raise the conversation beyond corruption to the broader system of rule of law?
Let me jump on that one, because I think, we talk corruption, and too often in our minds it's corrupt public officials, right? But sadly, the root of it is actually in corrupt private sector individuals. And it's the money that flows from these private sector individuals. I would say that Latin America is hardly oligarch-free, and that too many of these vested interests that don't want to see change, don't want to see their competitive advantage diminished because of the special relationships they have, that's where the corruption, to a very large extent lies. And so, I think what we're seeing in Brazil, for example, is very promising insofar as not just going after the public official, but the people who corrupted the public official. We're seeing it in Guatemala. We're seeing it in a lot of different places, and I think it's a very positive trend, one that I agree with you. We should be optimistic about. But I do think there's things that we have to start to help governments introduce that will now start to tackle this private sector corruption problem. We, at Citi, for example, and some of you might have heard of this program that we just launched it this year. It's called Tech for Integrity. And as I think most of us know who have had to go into, let's say, in a legal matter, do your due diligence and your interrogatories and your discovery, records are critical to the proof of corrupt activity. If you introduce more technology to a process, it is far harder for the corruption ultimately not to be discovered. And it tends to push that likelihood of someone being tempted to undertake a corrupt activity to not do it, simply because the potential for it being found out is much greater. So I think one of the solutions that we've got to be focusing in on, and I'm not pushing the Citi program, but it's got the right idea, and that is to to seek to introduce more technological methodologies, like using credit cards, for example, and reduce the amount of cash payments flowing through society. These are the types of things in records that can be traced, they can be quickly searched, there's lots of data analysis that's available to you. So I would encourage us to pay some attention to that. I think the other thing that I'd offer up is law school. Okay, so a lot of our officers in many of these governments are legally trained. I know, for one, when I was in law school, I sort of poo-pooed the idea of taking the ethics course, because it's sort of philosophy. But in my mind, that's really a problem. We've run into it in the financial sector, as all of you know, because of this financial crisis. There have been massive allegations of, bankers don't have ethics. And I can't tell you, even though I think I'm ethical, how many ethics courses I've had to go through now at Citi in order to demonstrate not only to our regulators that we care, but really to hone our sensitivities to it. And I would think that in law schools, particularly, this is the sort of the teaching ground for all of these future leaders that do end up in government, that they really start to emphasize more ethical studies and ethical considerations at that very early learning process, because my sense is that that's not there within the legal community as much as it could be down in Latin America.
Thank you.
I'll try a little bit different angle, maybe coming from an association and being an economist, not a lawyer. I'm accused sometimes of practicing without a license, but I'm not a lawyer. What I see, well, all of our members are multinational companies, even some of the smaller companies. We had 75% of our members are SMEs, and almost all of them deal internationally. And the relationship between the industry and the healthcare provider in our industry is very close. Some of the best ideas come from the interaction with physicians. A lot of our members train physicians. The technology changes about every 18 to 24 months, so there's a lot of interaction that has to come about. And there is, and our members, particularly American companies, have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What I see in country after country is a tension between, quite frankly, the multinational companies and the domestic companies, in the sense that the multinationals are really struggling to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to make sure that they train the company representatives, and they are responsible for the distributors in how they deal with, in an ethical fashion, with the healthcare providers. That's why we have a code, that's why we do a lot of training. The tension is, then they say, but I'm dealing with the locals, and they don't have to abide by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They have a competitive advantage. How do we work on that? So I think, in terms of your question, in terms of the inter-American process, whether it's AACCLA, whether it's OAS, we tried through the America's Competitiveness Agenda, to try to get government involved too, because, as I said, we have these codes of ethical business practices that we're striving to have companies adopt, but that's the private sector saying we won't be corrupt. But then you have the hospital providers, the doctors saying, well, why aren't you sending me to Hawaii for that training course? Yeah, I know, my wife is, but no, we went every other year. Or why aren't you paying me an extraordinary royalty for that book that I'm publishing that probably will sit on people's desks? And that's a struggle that our companies have. So I think having private sector, we're trying to deal with it, but I think having government deal with it is very helpful. We have a forum in APEC that helps us in the Asia Pacific, and I know some Latin American countries are part of APEC. It'd be great to have something in the Americas to help us address that.
If I might,
I only want to add one thing, because as you know, the next summit of the Americas will focus on democratic governance and fighting against corruption. And you, as private sector, I hope you have a voice, a very important voice in the process of preparation of the summit. And there is something that I would like to ask your support. The summit always, it's very focused on the linking between executive power. But in the fighting against corruption, we need more and more. And that is very difficult in the Americas until now. A more powerful work together between prosecutors of different countries and between judges of different countries. We have the treaties, but the mechanisms are very, very difficult to put in place, and we need to review a much more easy work together between prosecutors and judges. That is my message. One thing that we can work together as a result for the next summits. That I remember you. It's democratic governments and fighting against corruption. In democratic governance, we have the judiciary, the prosecutor, etc.
If I might, how would you like to see us be supportive in that space? Are you looking for us to help advocate in our home countries?
No, there is a lot of forums that with the participation of the private sector, and maybe you as private sector, you can put that as one of the issues. We will try to do that too.
You can be assured that we will. We play a very active role hosting the Secretariat here for the Americas Business
The results of your studies will be very, very, very important for the people who will need to finally agree on the mandates approved on the summit, that is the President of the Americas.
Thank you. I'm grateful to have an actionable takeaway that's going to allow us not only to work a little bit more closely with you in your office, but to be able to take this charge home and how we engage in our respective secretariats in advocating for this as part of the summit process. So I do thank you for that. If I might just ask around the question again of prosecutors and judges, because it's something that came up in the financial sector conversation just a moment ago, and it's something that is being reflected. Are there particular ways in which you have found it effective for us to advocate in the OAS system for greater judicial training or greater support for the results in the peer reviews that show where countries perhaps are lacking in those spaces? What's the best way to engage the OAS or support that process as you all are working with countries to address those shortcomings?
You know, we have a lot of ways to work with you. One is on the mechanism for the follow-up. Of course, each time that we evaluate one country, we receive the comment from the civil society of that country. Second, we are more and more involved on the preparation on model law. For model law, we need the support of the people who will work with the law. That is not only the parliament, but also the private sector, of course. We have on different issues, on security transaction, and a lot of things that can change the work in the countries. And now in the process of preparation on the Summit of the Americas, and also on the national issues. In one or two countries, we are much more involved. Now we are in a process. I hope we will try to work in a 3-year terms and agreement in Nicaragua, and we have received a lot of input from ATAM Nicaragua. We have a lot of meetings, periodically meeting, and that we can do it in other countries each time we are involved on particular issues. And that's something we need. We don't have reports like those that are very useful for us.
We'll be sure that you have it.
And thanks.
Kendra, I don't have an answer to this, but it does strike me that always at the root of these kinds of campaigns is a question of funding. And And it does seem to me that when I look at the budget numbers, for example, for how the current administration is going to be putting money in certain areas of emphasis, and rightly so for Latin America, there's a lot of money that's going to be thrown at the security question, which we've all acknowledged, and rightly so again. Without security, rule of law is a little tough to achieve. But I'm wondering whether we, again, in the private sector, ought to be looking at ways by which we don't necessarily rely on the governments to fund all of this. I'm sure we don't. I know we don't. But I think I could see a twofold campaign that might have great dividends to it. One is certainly to continue to encourage the governments to look at, when they allocate these hundreds of millions of dollars for security programs, maybe make a subset of that judicial, or somehow other forms of rule of law reforms, workshops, technical assistance, et cetera. And then secondly, on the private sector side, our hands aren't tied. I think we ought to be thinking much more aggressively about coming up with private sector sources of funds for the types of needs that we know are there, whether it's in judicial training or prosecutorial training or the kind of fora you're talking about, where you support that kind of dialogue, and that costs money. And if we in the private sector, AACCLA, this is something I think we really ought to give some serious thought to, because you don't spend money on it, you're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you for that. Ralph, did you have a...
No, I think the lawyer has addressed that very well.
Sometimes it is better to let the lawyers handle it. Well, I would like to just, pose a final wrapping question, and I'll ask each of you as you respond if there are any other last thoughts or key takeaways you'd like to leave with our audience, to include those at that time. Obviously, the study, the report is a call to action. We're here at AACCLA. We've marked 50 years. We have 50 years more to go. If you wouldn't mind telling us some ways that you would like to see us get engaged in carrying this fight forward beyond what Jean-Michel has articulated in the Summit of the Americas, how would you like to see AACCLA play a role in advancing rule of law in the hemisphere?
Should I start, since I dodged the last question? Well, basically, as we are looking at the areas of convergence and coherence, and to the extent AACCLA can continue to advance those, it's very helpful for the private sector, at least in the Americas, for the, as I mentioned, the medical device industry. We don't have a common hemispheric fora the way we do in APEC, and there's areas in Europe that we can kind of come together. What we're doing is coming together with those countries when they want to come together. So I think to the extent that AACCLA could provide a forum to maybe help us with the code harmonization, maybe help us with some of the training, so that people understand that this relationship between healthcare providers and the industry has to be based on purely ethical terms, and what that means. I know as an association, we spend a lot of time through hypothetical cases. Well, if the physician says this, what will you do? If your distributor does this, what will you do? So I think if there's a way that AACCLA could provide kind of a hemispheric forum, that would be very helpful.
I like that idea. Maybe building on that theme a bit is, because you asked the question earlier about public-private cooperation. And certainly AACCLA is, I think, in the most unique position to do that. There are obviously other groups that have the same idea of trying to develop better methods for serving the rule of law. But AACCLA as a business community, this is, I think we've observed over the years, this is a unique voice in the process. It's always the lawyers talking to lawyers, talking to judges. But for the business community to be saying something is very powerful. It's jobs, it's economy, it's economic development. And the theme that you rightly pointed out at the very, very beginning of this, that Jody was pointing to, that this is a, if you don't get the rule of law straight in your economy, you are going to suffer, and your economic development is going to suffer. And it's quite clear when you look at the numbers. That's not even a debate. But where the voice really needs to be, I think, turned up the volume is from the business community, and it's got to be more. It's got to be projected more in not only the dialogue with government, but also between ourselves. We've got to continue to remind ourselves how much of a priority this is, and I think AACCLA serves as a huge forum for that.
I was going to say, you set us up perfectly for that closing question.
We are really happy to receive every support, and the financial too.
Well, I can honestly say this has been a very enriching conversation. It's sometimes hard to take data from a screen and turn it into what this means in an industry case, what it means in an inter-American system format, but knowing that the work that we've done, not just through our surveys, but through our dashboard, can be useful in advancing the themes of how to confront corruption and advance rule of law. And the hemisphere is something we want to answer that request from the OAS. And so you can count on our support, Jean-Michel, that you will have the support of AACCLA and our rule of law work at the Chamber to help advance that effort in the hemisphere, because it is so critical to us. And obviously, as you heard from our business participants today, it's really critical to how we do our work and being able to operate in markets with ethics, with transparency and accountability and predictability, and being able to count on due process in so doing are really critical to how we will continue our hemispheric advance. So if you would, please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Thank you, and please also join me in thanking Kendra, who is obviously one of the greatest moderators we have at the Chamber. As Kendra aptly said, taking everything that the ideas emanating out of the region, the challenges that you're all facing them, and turning them to actions, as I think all of our panelists did here, gives us a lot to work on moving forward. However, in the immediate, I'd like to ask everyone if you could please get up, take your stuff with you. We're going to transition over to the briefing center next door for a quick 15-minute break, and then we'll come in here for lunch for our keynote address from Carla Hill. So if you could all please join me moving over to the next room. We'll come back in here in about 10-15 minutes to continue the conversation. Thank you. Well, if you haven't finished eating yet, please continue to do so, but we're going to go ahead and continue our program. As Jody mentioned during her presentation earlier this morning, there is no issue that holds, from our AACCLA membership's perspective, more growth opportunity, but obviously more challenge than the modernization process underway for NAFTA. And in fact, in just about 48 hours from now, negotiators will be meeting in Ottawa for the third round of negotiations. And so as we look to what that modernization can hold, both in terms of promise, but also in terms of challenges, we couldn't have asked for a greater set of panelists to join us this morning. On your right, you have Ambassador Carla Hills, former USTR, and on your left, we have Sean from the Financial Times, who no one really knows more about trade. No one knows more than you?
I'm on the right, she's on the
left. Left, right's hard for me. Sean is Carla, Carla is Sean. Well, with that, Sean, I want to turn it over to you, because we're really excited that you were able to come here and moderate this conversation. We've been obviously anxiously reading your articles for a long time now, and there's very few that know as much trade about you.
I think so. Thank you so much. Ruben, I am not Carla Hills. I'm Sean Donnan from the Financial Times. Really honored to be here with one of the true heroes of trade in this town, I think, over the years. Carla Hills, obviously the woman who gave you NAFTA in many days, and someone who has some strong opinions on what should happen now and the value of NAFTA, I guess. We're going to start off with a few minutes from the ambassador, in which she's going to walk us through her take on NAFTA and where we stand, and we'll have a short conversation up here, and then we'll open up to you guys to hopefully get some intelligent conversations. So, Ambassador, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you very much, Sean. Let me say what an honor it is to come and have an opportunity to exchange thoughts with the chambers. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is special, and the fact that it has a liaison throughout North America is very, very important today. It's also an honor to appear with Sean, one of the great reporters and our news media, and my goodness, we certainly need that today. We need to get the message out. And this is a conversation about the North American Free Trade Agreement that took effect in 1994. And I thought I'd just say a few words about what did it accomplish, what is its contribution today, and what are our challenges. And if you go back to the early 90s, what this agreement did do among Canada, Mexico, and the United States was eliminate all tariffs on industrial products. It was the first trade agreement to be negotiated between a developing country and developed countries. So it set a precedent in that way. It was a first agreement that provided protection for intellectual property. It was the first trade agreement to provide opening of services and protection for cross-border service providers. And it was the first agreement that had a really effective dispute settlement mechanism. And it was a template. You know, the Uruguay round had cratered in Europe in 1990, and we started the negotiations with our neighbors in 1991, June, and finished it in August of 92, 14 months later. President Bush Sr. signed it in December, and President Clinton got it through Congress in 93, and it took effect in 94. And 4 months after it took effect, all of the 126 then trade ministers had returned to the table and finished the GATT negotiations of the Uruguay round and put into effect rules governing intellectual property, some services, some agriculture, not as far as NAFTA, and created the World Trade Organization, which would not have happened, in my view, without that competitive liberalization by one of the largest trade regions in the world. And what does this agreement do today? It has had an extensive effect upon our trade, the United States. The interregional trade is up some sixfold to over $1 trillion. We have 14 million jobs that are related to our North American trade. We have created very integrated supply chains, which have made us more competitive and more productive, and therefore moved our GDP up the scale. And it's been a benefit for all three economies. You know, we've heard that it has killed manufacturing. Well, the United States had 700,000 manufacturing jobs in '93, and today we have 14 million. You know, it's just it's an amazing change. It's not all the same. Our jobs have changed, but it is an amazing change. But we have some challenges that are really quite profound today. And that is because the rhetoric has been so hostile. Most of it has been directed, I think the focus has been disproportionately on Mexico. You know, that Mexico has hurt the United States. In point of fact, our two neighbors are our first and our second largest export destinations. And when we export to Mexico, we sell more to Mexico than we sell to all the rest of Latin America. In fact, we sell more to Mexico than we sell to France, Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands combined. And it not only is an export destination, But because of our integrated supply chains, we have about 40% of their exports are U.S. products. And they have twice as many trade agreements as do we, so they have preferential access to many more markets than we. Their trade agreements, they have 44 countries, including the European Union. And so that they become a great export agent. And we should applaud and be very, very pleased with that. So there are many benefits that have come from our integration, and we need to build on it. We have many challenges as well. One of the challenges is to educate the American people about the benefits of trade broadly and the benefits of the North American Free Trade Agreement more particularly. You know, we hear that exports are good, but imports are bad. But 60% of what we import are intermediate products that make our exports competitive globally. And there are so many trade facts that we haven't gotten out about why the NAFTA is good for all of us. But I will say this, that the United States has been woefully deficient in providing a social program to deal with those who've been dislodged for whatever reason. Most economists say that the cause is we're living in a 21st century economy, which is much more driven by technology than in the last century when we negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. But that really doesn't provide any solace to the person who's lost their job when we tell them, well, it wasn't trade, it was technology. And in fact, our Trade Adjustment Assistance Program requires them to establish, if they lost their job, that there is a connection to trade, which is also a burden and is very underutilized. But there have been a lot of good analyses that show what we need to do, and we ought to talk about whether export or tax credits program, a stipend for relocation, a stipend for retraining, and public-private partnerships with companies. Those companies that are crying out for jobs. You know, in the United States today, we have 6 million unfilled jobs. I know that there are companies that would set up a training program of 15 to 25 weeks to help them find the proper people to fill those jobs. And so there's much more that we could do, but that's on the social program. Let's not kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Let's try to move along and protect that egg and get a second one. And that's really the challenge of today. My own view is that we need to persuade employers, and they could do that in so many different ways. If they're a small business, they could put it on the bulletin board of what the percentage is of their trade beyond our borders. They could put in the W-2 that X percentage, 39% of our revenues come from trade beyond our borders, and 39% of your check came from that trade. There are so many things that we could do to raise the information. And whether we talk to the Chambers of Commerce or the Rotary Club or the employers, they should get out and talk to the mayors. You know, if you look at the scale of who is doing business in Mexico and in Canada, they're the first and second largest markets for a majority of our states. And mayors know that, and that would make a difference. So it's a great honor to be able to talk to a distinguished group like this, representing the employment that we need so much in North America, and so that we could work together and really make a difference. But this agreement, I think, is a critical critical piece of the puzzle that we have to keep going. So, Sean, I hope you agree.
I see the critical piece in the puzzle. I also see some risks ahead, and I think that's part of the reason we're here, isn't it?
It is.
It's you've laid out a compelling case for NAFTA, for its benefits, for the benefits of free trade, and so on. But not everyone's buying into that argument,
I know.
as you say, including the guy across the street. Let's start off with the risks and the moment that we're at. How seriously should we take these threats of withdrawal from NAFTA? And what would be the consequences of a U.S. withdrawal from NAFTA?
Well, I think we should take it seriously, and I say that not as a pessimist, but I think that the value of the agreement is so important that any risk is one that we should address. And we are beginning to get the reputation as a nation, as a government, of being less reliable than in the past. You know, we walked away from the Paris Accord. We tore up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've talked in hostile terms about organizations that are closely related to our Western values of order. And so I think beyond our borders, people begin to think, well, here comes another one. And we have to work hard to keep it standing tall, straight, and effective.
I guess the charitable view or the optimistic view is that the president's threats to withdraw from NAFTA are just a negotiating tactic.
Many say that, and I hope it's true. I wouldn't recommend that negotiating tactic.
Well, that was my next question. Do you think it's an effective negotiating tactic? And if you were sitting in Bob Lighthizer shoes, would you want your president to be making that kind of noise behind you?
If I were a U.S. trade representative, I would want the president to be arm in arm with me on what we were trying to accomplish. I mean, after all, you work for the president. And so I would hope that we could work together. But I think back to when we were negotiating the NAFTA, and Jaime Serra and Herminio Blanco, who were representing Mexico, Michael Wilson and John Weeks representing Canada. You know, today we're still very good friends. We still stay very much in touch. And there wasn't hostility. We understood the economics. Each of us had different economic pressures. And also, we understood the politics. Each of us had political pressures. We knew what each of us could hardly do and what we absolutely could not do, which, by the way, are some of the areas that we want to address in upgrading the North American Free Trade Agreement. You know.
Well, let's talk about that. We've got this optimistic title to our chat here, the modernization of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Obviously, when you were sitting down to negotiate it, we didn't yet have the iPhone. The internet wasn't widely used. There's a lot that's happened in the world since then. You see a case for modernization, and where would you update it?
I absolutely see a case for modernization. I mean, we need to upgrade and make NAFTA 21st century, dealing with a 21st century economy. And that isn't to criticize the NAFTA. It is to say, as if you had an old house, but it was a grand old house, well, every once in a while it needs to be painted. And there were things that we couldn't negotiate in the early 90s. Mexico had a constitutional restriction on energy.
Right.
It's opened up. It had a restriction on telecommunications. That has changed. And as you mentioned, none of you had a cell phone. You didn't have, in the early 90s, many people didn't even have a desk computer. It was mainframe in the basement, and that was supposed to be a very modern leaning. So we have changed a great deal, and we need to deal with these things. We need to deal with rules governing digital flows and telecommunication and digital services. It's changed a lot.
Can you do all that in 4 or 5 months? I mean, you talked about negotiating the whole agreement in the first place in 14 months. Can these guys get it done? The renegotiation, the modernization, can they get that done by the end of this year?
It's a big task, but made easier with friendship and made easier with a full understanding of the economic and political obstacles so that you could try to find a way through the thicket. You know, in some of the areas of the NAFTA, we gave more time for some sectors to liberalize than immediate liberalization, understanding that there was a political challenge to sell it at home.
Right.
And there are all kinds of ways to make the right decision, but to help the other side be able to deliver. And I think that could be done today. 4 or 5 months, if we were to focus on modernization and get rid of quarreling, it would speed things up.
I'm not sure we're going to get rid of any quarreling so far based on what we've seen. Let's talk through some of the ideas that the administration is throwing out there at this point. Let's start with this idea about the U.S. trade deficit and that this should be the guiding metric for U.S. trade policy, that the U.S. should be seeking balanced trade with all of its trade partners, and that Mexico and the deficit there is one of the main targets in NAFTA. Do you think that's the right way to approach this?
I think that's not economically sound, and economists agree that it's not economically sound. Mexico has a deficit as well as we do. In fact, it's slightly, in percentage terms, higher than ours is of their GDP.
You mean a deficit with the world, rather?
With the world, the global GDP. I mean, excuse me, their deficit is as a percentage of their GDP. Their global deficit is a bit higher. And Canada too. So we're asking 2 deficit countries to please fix our deficit. Well, that doesn't work that way because the currency would compensate. And we have an experience. You know, we did all kinds of controls on Japan in 1980s. Voluntary restraint arrangements on semiconductors, export control rules on autos, and we had a deficit. And by putting those controls on and trying to decrease the amount of imports coming in did not improve our deficit, to the contrary. So deficit is not the way to go. I think that we have some domestic issues that we could address that would make a difference, and taxation,
right,
infrastructure, and those sorts of things that would make us more competitive. But that's what we need to focus on.
So you don't see anything that you can do in NAFTA to improve that deficit position? I mean, this is, trade agreements don't fix deficits, I think.
Actually, by opening the market, you
right,
get a better chance to fix the deficit because you are able to acquire the items that are the most competitive to get your products more competitive globally, and it helps your population if they can buy the lower level products, sure, at a cheaper product. Then they have more money to spend, and the spending creates business, which reduces, will help, sure, your economy.
Sure, sure. Let's go through some of the other ideas that are out there. One is of a sunset clause. We keep hearing reports that the administration is tabling this idea that every 5 years NAFTA should be revisited. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that's a very, very bad idea. And I say that because if you knew as an investor that the agreement was going to be re-examined, or even worse, had to be renewed, that it would cease after 5 years, rather like a statute of limitations, would you invest in that country? If you plan to invest in any country, Mexico, Canada, the United States, it'd probably take you a couple of years to get your plans, get organized, and you wouldn't get a payback that would be sufficient. So you would hold your hand, you'd steady, you wouldn't do it. And so I don't think that that's useful at all.
What about dispute resolution? One of the things we've heard also is this idea of an investor-state dispute settlement system that is opt-in or voluntary for the participants. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, from the view of the United States, the investor-state dispute settlement has been useful. We've never lost a case, and that's Chapter 11. It's something that I think has been beneficial. The NAFTA works off of arbitration panels and its 3 mechanisms of dispute settlement resolution, and that is faster and cheaper than our court system. Also, it sets an example. You know, if we were to upgrade the North American Free Trade Agreement, then others would draw upon it and implement some of the things that we have done. And I think that having a good dispute settlement mechanism with some countries that don't have as reliable a court system as do we would be something that our investors and our exporters would very much relish.
Sure. A lot of the trade in the world is in cars nowadays, and certainly a lot of the trade in North America is in cars. There's some people who say the vast majority of the trade deficit with Mexico relates to autos and the auto trade there. I wonder, Wilbur Ross has talked about the need to update the rules of origin. These are the kind of nitty-gritty rules that determine how much of a car has to be made in North America in order to qualify for duty-free status. Do you think that's a good idea? Can you in some way manipulate the rules of origin so that you get more manufacturing happening in the US?
Well, you mentioned autos. The auto rule of origin is 62%, basically. I would not be troubled by that. Some have suggested that that needs an enforcement mechanism, that it is circumvented to a certain extent, and so that the average North American content is more like 54%. So if you wanted to keep it up at 62 or 62.5, depending on the vehicle, you could enforce it. But that's something that the 3 negotiators could sit and talk about. I mean, the upside is if they can agree, all right. The downside is if you are a small and medium-sized business, and in the United States, small and medium-sized businesses, that is businesses that have below 500, I think it's 500 employees. Mm-hmm. It's tough to assimilate different rules, change in rules. So would the benefits outweigh that? Because small and medium-sized enterprises that make up 90% of our 300,000 exporters, 90%, not in value, but in numbers, you want the rules to be simple so that they can implement them, understand them, and not become a bulwark to their having international commerce. So I personally would leave it the way it is. Yep. And simplify it. If you keep as much as you can the way it is, and then upgrade it for the 21st century.
Can we get back to this question of American leadership? You talked about in your opening remarks this issue of trust and the erosion of trust in Washington related to withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, from the TPP, and just the way international institutions are spoken about in this administration. How much, we're 9 months into an administration. Can you repair that trust? How hard is it going to be to repair that trust? And how worried are you about the competition? Whether it's from China or the EU, which is now negotiating with Mercosur and trying to renegotiate its own trade agreement with Mexico.
We'll have to work on it, and it's going to take all of you. We're going to have to show that we really care about the rest of the world. It isn't just America alone. It's America and all of us together, because in today's economy where we're so connected by phone and internet and so forth, we don't prosper when we have great problems that erupt. And certainly that's true in this hemisphere. We do better when all do well, and we should do everything that we can. Can we repair it? I think we have to work on it. And you know, one of the things that we have to recognize is that the president's team has not all been appointed. In fact, the U.S. Trade Representative doesn't have a deputy and is trying to renegotiate the NAFTA, talk about the Korean agreement, bring some enforcement actions, and that's a big inbox.
Right.
So I think that it is important. I hope that the team gathered is able to walk into the Oval Office and have some data to show the president these are the good things that can come from what I'm recommending. Mm-hmm. And I am recommending that we continue to be a leader in trying to extend Western values.
Do you see any reason for optimism when you look at trade policy in this administration right now?
We have to be optimistic. And I'm optimistic that our people, I'm optimistic that if we work at it, that if employers really work at it and say, look, I'm not going to have the same opportunities tomorrow unless the people really understand what's at stake. So I'm going to become an advocate for my team, whether they be 500 or 50,000 people, and do some things that advance the understanding, because I can tell you that if I were to walk out the front door of the Chamber's beautiful offices and talk to the first 100 people that I met to say, what do you think about the North American Free Trade Agreement? They'd say, well, I'm not sure what's that. And then you begin to explain it to them. Well, I've heard that that's really bad for the country, and I know someone who's lost his job, so no, I guess I'm not for it. Yeah. So we've got to fix that. And between journalism and commercialism, yeah, we can do it. We've been in hard times before. We were talking earlier about the mid-'70s. Yeah. Not an easy time. And in the mid-'70s, we had a vice president who had to step down out in corruption, a president of the Watergate scandal, the May Day riots, the oil that put the gas lines around the block, all 7 bridges were closed because of the unhappiness here in Washington, and yet we had a president who reached across the aisle and gradually brought stability to the system. And the 80s and the 90s were pretty good for the United States. So it can be done. It just must be done.
I'm just, as you were talking there, I was just thinking about if I walked out the door of the Chamber of Commerce, how many of those first 100 people I saw would be people from the White House on their lunch break. But it's just given the special place and geography of the Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. I think we should probably open it up to the floor.
Okay.
Are there any questions out there on the floor? And if we can ask you there's some microphones circulating, we ask you to identify yourself and keep it to a question rather than a lecture. Over here.
Thank you. David Lewis, Manchester Trade, Ambassador Hills. Good to see you again. We were Monday with USTR Lighthizer. I'm not stalking you. He made a very clear point Monday morning, basically disagreeing with the sense that we haven't, that we need to educate and share more information about these trade agreements and so on. And it seems to me, I don't think we went into detail with him on that at that session, but I think it underlies really a sort of major philosophical difference in terms that this is an issue about facts. If we get the facts right and we explain them and we have enough studies and reports in the Financial Times, maybe on Facebook, I don't know, people will understand it and will turn it around. I'm wondering if you could share your views on that, because I think it really goes to the heart of where the administration is pushing. Thank you.
You make a really interesting point. And just for those who weren't there at the speech on Monday, Ambassador Lighthizer has been fairly media shy. This was one of his rare public appearances at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And one of the points he made was that people, pro-free traders, always argue that people in the Rust Belt aren't hearing us, that we need to explain it better to them, rather, and his point was simply, that's not the issue. The issue is that these people are hurting. It's an issue of policy rather than an issue of communication.
Well, I think that it's twofold. One is talking about the farmer in the Midwest. Probably he recognizes that one of his great markets is Mexico. Our agricultural markets are up 400% as a result of the market opening that occurred with respect to agriculture. But we also, for those who have lost their job, I think we need to provide some assistance. And we, as I mentioned, trade adjustment assistance is insufficient. It's delegated to the states. You have to establish the factual connection between your job loss and you getting the benefit. The problem is most economists will tell you that the majority of our loss of jobs results from technological advancements.
Robots rather than
Yeah,
NAFTA.
and you mentioned autos earlier. You know, you used to go on the floor of an auto company and it looked like New York at Fifth Avenue at Christmas time. It was just crowds of people. Today you go on and you are told to walk in a line that is demarked, and the 4 or 5 people who are on the floor have long smocks, buffers on their shoes, and look like they're in a pharmaceutical company because they are working with computers. And The Economist in July had a wonderful article about how 3D printing can produce a nozzle for an airplane with 90% less loss and 50% 90% less waste and 50% fewer workers.
Yeah. No, it's an amazing time of change. Well, I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting in terms of the communication sphere, and some people who are based here in Washington may have heard me say this before, but I actually think we've seen an amazing communications moment in terms of trade, and that partly is the consumer case. And one of the things I attribute that to is a tweet by Lindsey Graham, which I think was the greatest piece of trade communication. My apologies to folks here at the Chamber, but that we've seen this year. And that was shortly after Sean Spicer stood up on Air Force One and said that they thought they had found a way to, this is way back in February, and it shows you how far things have come, that Sean Spicer is no longer with us, instead it's on the Emmys. But that he stood up on the plane and said we'd found a way, the administration had found a way to pay for that wall, to get Mexico to pay for that wall, and that was a 20% tax on imports from Mexico. This is back in the days when we were talking about a border adjustment tax. Very shortly thereafter, Lindsey Graham, very, very quickly, the reporters on the plane said, hang on a second, that's a tax on U.S. consumers, which I thought was good of my profession. And secondly, within a few hours, Lindsey Graham tweeted out something that I thought was fabulous, which was anything that raises the price of beer, tequila, or margaritas is a terrible idea. Mucho sad. Within a few days, I have never seen so many journalism assets dedicated to avocados. We had great graphics about avocado supply chains in Mexico, to the point where by the time you got around to the Super Bowl, one of the great ads was for avocados from Mexico, which was making a case for NAFTA quietly through the bellies of football fans all around the U.S. So I mean, I think you're right in saying that we have seen this amazing pushback.
Yes, definitely.
So let's pray for more tweets from Lindsey
More
Graham.
guacamole.
Yeah. Any other questions? Right in the middle there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ana Lopez Mestre from American Chamber, Mexico. so I couldn't agree more with you. We do face a huge challenge in terms of communications, and it's very inspiring to hear your views on the value of Mexico as a strategic partner for the US and Canada. So I just wanted to thank you, and I will be inviting you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were just there in Mexico. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found down there?
I think that there's a worry in Mexico because 80% of their trade comes to the United States. And so that if something happens to the North American Free Trade Agreement, I think it is hugely harmful to the Mexican economy. But it would be harmful to all three economies because we have such integrated supply chains that would be disrupted. Mexico would obviously look elsewhere. It's already talking to China about investments and manufacturing. It's looking to Brazil with respect to agriculture. And it's making plans just in case. And let's just hope that we are more reliable as a partner and that we can continue the bond that is creating jobs, opportunity, growth, and moving people up the income scale on both sides, I would say.
So I'm told by my boss over here on the side that we've run out of time, but if you can just join me in thanking Ambassador Carla Hills.
Thank you. And you were terrific.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to see you.
And Sean, thank you so much for joining us as well. That really was fantastic. And I promise, this is a crowd of optimists. If you saw the presentation Jody gave this morning, there was no one more optimistic about the future that this region holds, this hemisphere holds, than everyone here. So I want to thank you for all of that. And Carla, I promise we'll be optimistic, we'll be vocal, and we'll be out there. So thank you very much. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break now, so if I could ask you all to transition back into the briefing center. We'll come back here in about 10 minutes to have a conversation that goes a little bit beyond North America and about the inter-American system as a whole. So thank you very much. We'll transition in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining us again, and obviously that was a fantastic lunch session, and we're going to now transition to a more hemispheric conversation on what the opportunities are. If you could all please take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us for the second half of today's event. Now that we're transitioning away from the NAFTA-specific conversation, 5 years ago, Jody partnered with the Inter-American Development Bank and its president, Luis Alberto Moreno, to start building what is now known as the CEO Summit of the Americas. And we've built on that partnership over the past 5 years as part of the Inter-American system. So I want to turn it over to Jody Hanson-Bond, the Senior Vice President of the Americas for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for a conversation with Luis Alberto Moreno, the President of the Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruben, and welcome everyone back from lunch, post-discussion with Sean Donovan and Carla Hills about NAFTA. I think this is probably the most exciting part of the day. And simply put, we could have had no better friend to take time out of his day to come visit us than Luis Alberto Moreno. You know, Tom Donahue counts on you as one of his longtime friends, and he apologized he couldn't be here today to all of our chambers, but he's really grateful that you're taking time to talk with us. This network of 24 chambers in 28 countries represents 80% of U.S. foreign direct investment in the hemisphere. And so it's all these leaders around the room here who have been working with the IDB on public-private partnership solutions. And today we've, for those of you who don't know, but most in this room do, how many collaboration partnerships we have with the IDB. Let me just cite a couple of those. First and pivotally, the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle has been a real initiative that has had some significant value for those of our chambers in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, who are here with us today. And it's we're at a critical crossroads in terms of the stakeholders from those countries have been really awaiting some tangible action related to security, rule of law, and beyond. But I can assure you that your leadership has been a driving force of their feeling like their environments are getting the attention they need. Likewise, we did team up with you on an event in Miami with Vice President Pence and with the governments of Mexico and Colombia and others in June. And I think that's given a real infusion of something that we're working on together and collaboratively. Similarly, the America's Business Dialogue is something that we have served as the U.S. Secretariat of the Inter-American Development Bank's Secretariat of the ABD, it's called, and it is expertly overseen by President Moreno. It's a first of its kind hemispheric public-private dialogue that focuses on regional economic security priorities. And believe it or not, we are just months away from the Summit of the Americas in Lima, Peru. So the IDB and the chamber teams have been already working side by side on our private sector issues to define key outcomes, and we welcome the engagement of all the hemispheric chambers of commerce in leading up to that summit. One of the key points in the summit, and this was my moment to give an overview here, is rule of law. Rule of law is, simply put, has been a thrust of the conversation this morning. You know, our businesses every year do an economic forecast, a forecast on the Americas, and it basically sets the tone for what we need to engage in, what are our challenges, and what are our opportunities. And the dominant part of the conversation, whether it was the Andean, Central America, South America, thematically is that the rule of law and transparency, predictability, accountability, due process, what is the operating environment that we can affect in order to bolster investor confidence in the region. And so we presented our study today, and we hope to be able to share elements of that, but we appreciate that you'll be taking on a leadership role and thematically in the upcoming summit here with our priorities at the forefront. So let's, I think, rather than talk a little bit more about the study, let's talk a little bit about Lima and the 2018 Summit of the Americas, and tell us what you, Mr. President, would see as a successful summit from your vantage point, since you've been involved in so many of these. Tell us about your aspirations forthcoming in 2018 in Peru.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jody. It's always a pleasure to be here. I have really, over all the years I've been in Washington, been privileged to have always a very good connection with the Chamber and what it did in my prior incarnation as Ambassador of Colombia and, of course, now at the IDB. And certainly, we've been able to really develop something that really wasn't in the cards in the previous summits. And, you know, you always had the fear that when you had this huge effort of bringing the President of the United States to a summit in the Americas, that it was always a hostage to the political problems of the day. And I think once that we introduced this notion of a business dialogue, not unlike what happens with APEC, which has the ABAC organization and the thematic drivers of much of the summit, I think the summit changed for the better. and it was during President Obama. I still remember when he went to Cartagena, we had the business summit, and he pulled me aside and he said, look, this business summit for me means I didn't waste my time. And then, of course, we saw what happened in Panama. So, you know, the reality is that I think not only are we having something substantive, but we've spent a lot of time to make sure that the recommendations that come from the business community are not just a piece of paper, but rather an actionable item. And, you know, Fabricio Perti and his team have been working very hard on this. And I think this is what's going to drive a lot of the issues that are in the minds of the business community, which are some of the ones that you just mentioned. Having said that, you know, we are now coming to a time where, on the one hand, you have 80% of Latin Americans going to the polls between this year and next. Why? Because you will have elections next year in countries like Brazil and Mexico and Colombia, which, in terms of population, as you know well, we're talking close to 400 million people. So it's about those three countries alone, a very important part. But equally, this year you'll have them in Chile, you'll have in Honduras, I mean, you have in Costa Rica, you have in a huge number of countries. And I think the interesting thing is the outcomes that are coming of these elections. And I think it's very interesting to watch how more maturity in the Latin American electorate in terms of some of the issues that you mentioned. You mentioned rule of law. I think we are in a very good place. It will take time where to really see the kinds of advances that everybody expects. But this issue of rule of law has been in the agenda for many, many years. And the issues of rule of law you can break down in a number of areas. First of all is the whole question of administration of justice and the lack of, you know, expedient and solid administration of justice. The other are the questions of corruption, which are today the top priority, even in many of the so-called the Latin Barometer, which, you know, polls over 18 countries in Latin America. This, with citizen security today, is one of the highest issues in the minds of Latin Americans, more so than, say, jobs. And no longer is this something that people here in this chamber or in the White House or at the IDB are saying to the countries, this matters. It is in the streets of Latin America. And, you know, Mark Furstein, who's here and who, you know, I was privileged to work very closely when the whole plan for the prosperity of the Northern Triangle countries knows, you know, look at what's happened just in the Northern Triangle countries. Yeah. And, you know, it always reminds me when one looks at American history, you know, the U.S. declared its independence, and one of the reasons of declaring independence from the UK is because you perceived that it was a corrupt system. And then when Teddy Roosevelt came into government at the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was all this fight against the trusts where you had these problems of corruption that were so visible. And then over the years, you had the case of Boeing and what led into legislation that then brought the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think you're seeing much of that happening as we speak in Latin America. We have a number of cases. I mean, take the case of Chile. We worked very hard there in helping craft what's called the laws of probity and transparency. Understanding that one of the elements that drives corruption is campaign finance. And, you know, more and more this is something that countries are taking stock of, and understanding that you need to finance campaigns more through the public budgets than through private budgets, who then turn around and expect something in return. So, you know, I know I talk perhaps in circles, but I think this is a very central issue. I've talked a number of times with President Kuczynski as late as last week, and I mentioned a lot of the work that we're doing, you know, trying to bring all the best minds around the world on this very issue, such that the countries of Latin America can perhaps use the summit as a place to begin to have this discussion. Because more than just having another tribunal or another law, I mean, you can look at all the conventions on anti-corruption. They're all in paper. But I think what we need is the actionable items, the ones that begin to, again, build the trust that societies need to have in governments, such that you could really advance. In terms of the commercial disputes, which I would characterize as different, I think there are some countries that have begun to do some progress in, let's call it, the administration of commercial law. I think one of the areas that has contributed to this certainly have been the trade agreements, because I think the trade agreements have provided for a framework that basically is elevated into treaties that make parties more accountable. Now, it doesn't work very well in all the countries. Yes, that is true. But equally, I think issues of arbitration, labor disputes, these kinds of things, I find that there are countries making progress. And of course, in anything related to the rule of law, nothing goes very fast.
Well, thank you. I think that's congruent with part of our conversations earlier from last night and from today, especially with respect to where our investors go to first. Not surprisingly, Chile is the easiest market for them to look at. And then Chile and all its other agreements it bolsters that investment decision even more so. I was going to ask a couple questions about the upcoming summit dialogue and some anti-corruption public-private partnership programs, but you've got my brain now on trade, and I think I might even skip ahead and just talk about the operating environment. Carla Hills was just up here, and she was talking with Sean Donovan from the Financial Times. We were talking about the NAFTA and about all these other regional trade agreements earlier today that are critical, we think, to us. I guess from your vantage point, because we're at an unusual moment in time, is any comments, and I don't know if we're off the record or on the record, but I can tell you that we'd be interested to hear, because you've been so involved with helping create, foster, and grow this amazing set of trade agreements that we have, and tell us from your perspective how this operating environment, you see it affecting the investors and the investment community.
Well, look, I come at this from the perspective that, globalization is a force of good. When I look at the history of Latin America and I look back at the last 15 years, it was largely due to more open trading regimes that we were able to capitalize and truly create savings that helped mobilize close to 100 million people out of poverty and into the middle classes. Certainly, that same story is probably in the Western world today much under question. But I think it's too much to ask of trade to solve problems of societies where you have certainly tremendous pressures on the middle class, when you see situations that tell you that close to 50% of Americans, if they have an emergency, cannot save close to $800. That is a much deeper issue. And you cannot just solve it with a problem of trade. When I look at the relationship between Latin America and the United States, I think maybe this is a discussion that the Chamber can bring even more to bear, because it's to a large degree an uninformed discussion. When you think that 26% of the total trade of the United States is with Latin America, granted an important portion of that is with Mexico, close to 45%. When you think that the total trade between our hemisphere, or within our hemisphere, is over $1 trillion a year. When you think that we have, in essence, a surplus of close to $7 billion, as opposed to, say, exports of the United States are 3 times higher to Latin America than they are to China, and China alone provides for 2/3 of your current commercial deficit. So I look at this more in the sense of, what is the opportunity that is being missed? Because if we look at Latin America today and just go back to the year 2000, China's trade with Latin America was almost nothing. is close to 14%, and growing. Perhaps the latest numbers put it closer to 16%. And the overall trade with Asia is about 25%. And that happened in less than 20 years. So the question is, the world will continue, and this huge trading opportunity is to be embraced. So instead of talking about made in Guatemala or in Argentina, I would talk about made in the Americas. And I think that's the real opportunity to be built, because more and more, today we're in a world where production is done around value chains. Commerce is less on ships and more on e-commerce, and you guys follow this very closely. If you look at the total numbers of the growth of trade historically, trade would grow at about 1 or 2% faster than world global growth, which, as we know, has been low for the last number of years. But even then, in the past 3 or 4 years, trade was growing below global growth. Those numbers, as you know, have turned around. And I look at that and I say to myself, and I know people from UPS and other transportation companies like them are here, electronic commerce is growing at a rate of 30% and more in Latin America alone. And that is basically the answer to a huge consumer market that has emerged over the last decade and a half. So when I look at this, I say, look, I think we need to, one, inform the conversation, and two, if the litmus test is all about deficits or surpluses, where we're on the right hand of the ledger, where we have a lot of surplus with Latin America, and so we better take advantage of it if you're people in this room who think that there is more to gain if we all work together than work divided.
Well, we couldn't agree more, and I think that those facts are the piece of the puzzle that maybe we've been reactivated to talk about how the world is changing and how we're not going to leave people behind. Speaking of people in difficult situations, I know that all of us were mentioning that we were concerned for Mexico yesterday and for the Caribbean and all of the natural disasters that have recently occurred. I think that as we speak, a Category 5 Hurricane Maria is bearing down on Puerto Rico only days after Irma devastated much of the Eastern Caribbean. Some of our leaders here from all those countries today. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what the IDB does in terms of disaster preparedness or response. We at AACCLA, we partner with PADF and to marshal private sector resources, but what do you think regional governments or multilateral institutions like the bank and the private sector could do together to respond?
Look, first of all, my heart goes out to the people of Mexico. It's amazing what they've gone through. It's almost incredible to think that it happened the same day that they had one of the worst earthquakes. And, the one thing that you gotta give to the Mexican people is just look at the level of solidarity and empathy that the Mexicans have. Everybody is all hands on deck. Everybody trying to help and do the right thing. And I think that's an example bear none. Having said that, I'm sure you all remember when we had Katrina, it was the Mexican relief efforts that came very quickly. And I mentioned that because the Mexican system after that earthquake almost 30 years ago is one in which is probably the most sophisticated in Latin America. They have a system of auto insurance. So every year when the budget of the Mexican government goes to the Congress, has a line item to prepare for natural disasters. And they can securitize some of that money, which they do, such that the day something happens, they automatically have a way to pay for it. But equally, this whole system of first responders is really one of the best in the hemisphere. And yet, you have to deal with this kind of disaster. It's hard to predict earthquakes, and the interesting thing is that what the Mexican government found was that there's other ways to take out risk from a budget or from a country, which is through parametric insurance, which is, you say, well, if I have an earthquake of 1.6 or, excuse me, 6, then the damages you can estimate will be X, and then you can go and reinsure, so that the overall cost of insurance is lower. I really worry about what's happening in the Caribbean today. And I spent the last 3 days in New York in the margins of the UN General Assembly, because I think we really need, and I saw a number of people here in the room from many of the Caribbean countries, I don't think we can continue to look at this issue just from the perspective of one day the Dominican Republic, the next Puerto Rico, the next Barbuda, the next Haiti. I think it requires a whole approach on the wider Caribbean. What is driving and the strength and the force of these hurricanes is the fact that the temperature of the oceans is higher. And by the way, I'm not an expert or engineer, so I just repeat what I hear from the experts who I've met. And they'll tell you, all of them, that the reason that there is so much more force in these hurricanes is precisely because of that. So you have, on the one hand, if you look at a graph over the last 15 years, you'll see that the number of hurricanes into the Caribbean is just every year compounding at a rate of close to 25%. But the strength and the damage that is coming is much higher. So I think we need to step back because, for instance, after the problems that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I think it's going to be very hard to find insurance to be able to put in many of these islands. Even though they are islands, there's a tremendous amount of economic connectivity between the islands. So if something bad happens to an island of close to 45,000 people like San Martin, it can have a lot of economic effects on the surrounding islands. So I think we need a strategy that looks at the whole of the Caribbean. I think because of the issues of insurance, we're going to have to upscale the kind of construction codes, because much of the damage that you see in a place like Barbuda is because many of the buildings were below code.
Right.
So it's very important to do that. The other part is, this is equally an opportunity, I think, to really work on something that has always been an aspiration in the Caribbean, is to truly bring down the costs of energy, which you can today through renewable energy.
Right.
You have the lowest cost of energy in the world, which is North American gas, as an example, but equally, you have a number of alternatives which can create a base load for energy, which are around, say, solar or geothermal in some of the islands. But that connectivity we need to put in place. And so anybody who's dealt with the Caribbean knows that the politics of this is never easy because, you know, it's getting a lot of people together. But I truly believe that this is the time to do something of a very large scope that looks at energy. I know with Vice President Biden, we worked very hard at this, and he did a number of meetings, and it was tremendously successful to see American interests going into these islands and beginning to do like in Jamaica, to entirely change the whole energy matrix from fossil fuels to natural gas, coming from a North American supplier. So these things are doable today, and I think we need that kind of focus in the Caribbean. And actually, I went to our board this morning because we are limited into what we can do in the Caribbean. We have basically, you know, some of the islands that are either British or Dutch or English, or US or French. It's almost like a G7 kind of thing. Canada has huge interest. And then there's the other independent islands. So I think we need to just kind of take a larger scope, begin to, and one of the things I want to really focus is beginning to establish what the damage assessment is. There are islands where a lot of people have left. There's almost nobody in Barbuda. Some of the British islands, a lot of the people have left. And so, you know, these are also going to be employment opportunities for the, you know, places like Haiti and others where they have tremendously good workforce. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking to do, and I hope that we can get around in creating that kind of effort that needs to have a collective action around the Caribbean.
Well, you can count on some sort of appropriate partnership here with the AACCLA organization and network, and as the Chamber Foundation and AACCLA are looking to partner, you know, we'd be proud to be a part of that. Speaking of crises, I think the most acute political, economic, and humanitarian crisis is happening in one of the biggest countries, and that is Venezuela. And I guess as this is unfolding, if you could talk a little bit about how the IDB is responding to what we consider a tragedy in Venezuela. We have the head of our AmCham Venezuela here today. We're grateful, but we would love to hear your thoughts.
Look, my heart goes out to all the people of Venezuela. I'm married with a Venezuelan, and I know that the tough people in Venezuela are the women, not the men. But look, I think we're at a point that, yes, the international community can rally around, more and more putting the kind of pressure on the government to do something as simple as to apply the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
What does the Constitution of Venezuela says? You have an independent Congress that basically needs to be respected. You need to have an independent judiciary. You need to release political prisoners. You need to basically put the rule of law in place. Now, we're at a point where the speed of deterioration of Venezuela is dramatic. I mean, I was hearing this morning that there's apparently shortages already of gasoline in Caracas. Venezuela was a country importing just 3 or 4 years ago close to $70 billion. Now it's importing $10 billion. Well, that's right there the explanation for the huge amount of shortages. You are right that we all are seeing this from the economic perspective, but as you correctly say, the humanitarian dimension of this is terrible. Mm-hmm. I see it in my own country, in Colombia, the numbers of stories of people just coming to the border. I mean, I'm happy to say that a lot of them have been embraced, but more and more people are going into Colombia, more and more. I was talking to the president of Brazil. He was telling me that in the northern states of Brazil, they have a number of literally camps where people are coming in from Venezuela. And this is not a small country. Venezuela is a country of 30 million people. So I think, it's very important to continue to have the pressure. You already have, the core of the Latin American countries have basically stepped up. But at the end, the only solution possible is to somehow find a way to come together, and the Venezuelan people are going to have to find a way of how they come together. If there is an election, if there's a transparency in the election, and that could be literally in 15 or 16 months, that begins to plow the seeds for a solution. But, my worry, of course, is that we have very little time. In terms of what we are doing at the bank, the answer is almost nothing. We have not lent to Venezuela in over 6 years. We have a portfolio of roughly $1.8 billion, $2 billion. But, there's not much that we can do in this environment.
Interesting. Let's move a little bit to some of the migration areas and talk about, what's going to happen in our beloved Colombia. For the first time in so many years, you have an election with all these candidates. You have a post-peace process environment. And I think because it's you, many of these people here would love to hear what you're thinking about the landscape and the environment as President Santos nears the end of his term and a peace process but in alignment with the United States is in place. What is your outlook for Colombia with the upcoming election? Tell us about it, because very few people may actually know what's going on there.
Look, I wish I had the crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen.
I want to know.
When it looks like the Republican primary in the United States, but by 2, because a very open race. You have, like you said, 30 candidates, which at the end, in a system like Colombia, will end up being a process of coalition creation. Mm-hmm. And you'll probably have a coalition with a center-right and a center-left coalition. And I think it's too early to see how that will all play out. I think at the end, I think the Colombian people will make the right choice. They normally have. Mm-hmm. And there's big challenges going forward. I mean, unfortunately, we're in a period where, the peace process took a long time. And that's basically brought into a discussion in the country where somehow we seem to look at what happened in the past, and countries do not progress if not, they are not looking and focused on the future. And secondly, the fact that our economy, like most Latin American economies, is in a low trend growth, and that of course affects people. And issues of security, people don't want to go through another peace process but not entirely happy with what they got. So I think that all needs to be sorted out in the process of the election, which is a place to do it.
Well, earlier today I got a little bit chastised for not asking the audience questions to make this a little more interactive. I wanted to, if you're okay with that,
Sure,
I
please.
wanted to ask if there's anyone in the audience. You've got one shot before the Summit of the Americas right here on stage to ask President Moreno about any issues in your neighborhoods, and we have to pick between those two right over there.
Thank you. Hi, JP Carrasco, President of AmCham Guatemala. The IDB has been a critical player in moving forward the Alliance for Prosperity. However, there still has been little effective advance in the Northern Triangle countries with this initiative. Now more than ever, I think this initiative is very important for the region. Where do you see the initiative going forward, still this year and next year, and what role can the IDB play to better convert the initiative into tangible actions and changes in policy? Thank you.
Look, this is a very good question, and situation, as we all know, in Guatemala is not easy as we speak. It's created, they basically got rid of their former president. Current president, as we know, is there's a big debate ongoing. People in the streets of Guatemala are demanding what they demanded before this election. But I think despite all of it, what I find is that there is a core in the US Congress and in the administration. And I give credit to what the President Obama did and to this administration to continue doing this program of the Alliance for Prosperity. I think there's an understanding that for change to happen, you need time.
Right.
I think in terms of the business community of the three countries, they equally have to do some of what we did in Colombia, which is to demonstrate that you're not gonna just let the American taxpayers do all the effort. On the contrary, the business community in all of your countries needs to step up, and that's something that we have been working both with Guatemala, with Honduras, and with El Salvador in creating different kinds of mechanisms, fundamentally at the end of the day, to fill some of the gaps, especially in infrastructure, that create the connectivity across the countries that can collectively help them to grow faster. I think also, you always have this big lag between the time the US Congress approves something and things actually happen on the ground. Members of the US Congress would like to see action the next day. Right. Your system, I'm talking the American system, takes a long time to put things into place, and then countries sometimes are not quite ready to receive that aid in the way it needs to happen. I do believe, however, there's room for improvement on both sides. I think the way a lot of the USAID money is deployed, it probably needs to be bundled up in larger numbers to create more impact. I think some of the projects are, on average, about $3 million. It's hard to have impact when you have programs that small. Perhaps there's ways to, I was talking to Mark Green yesterday, ways to really do a rethink around this. And on the other hand, the security dimension to the problems of the Northern Triangle are not small, and I think continuing to advance on the security is critical. You don't have economic growth without security. Security is a precondition, but that's not enough. You need to continue to invest in the other areas of the economies, and this is where we at the IDB have been very focused. I have to say equally that in the last 2 years alone, the three countries together have committed close to $2 billion out of their own resources to support this program.
It's huge. We had one last question, cognizant of time. think PriceSmart.
If I can. Good afternoon. Ernesto Grijalva from PriceSmart. We are a membership warehouse club throughout Central America, Colombia, and the Caribbean. Two things. We've been talking a lot about transparency and rule of law. For transparency and rule of law, automation, anything that you can do to help there, it reduces corruption. We've seen it, we know it, and we love it whenever we can see it. The second is a path of unintended consequences. The funding language that exists with the IDB, World Bank, IMF, everybody, the development banks, they give funding to the Northern Alliance countries, include language that state that they have to increase tax revenues. The unintended consequence of that, because the real intent was to reduce tax evasion, but because the language is increased tax revenue, what is happening is the tax compliant are being overtaxed. If that continues, foreign investment will be reduced in these countries. So to the extent that it's possible that within the IDB and speaking with your colleagues, the World Bank and IMF, you can change that language to reduce tax evasion, we would be tremendously grateful.
Well, on the second part of your question, I wish we could be as strong as to put a conditionality saying a country has to increase taxes, because I think we'd be doing many countries a lot of good. We don't, we can't. Our conditionality is focused entirely on each of the loans depending on the outcomes we want of the loan, and based on a set of parameters that we agree beforehand of the kind of outcomes that we want, and of course we introduce the metrics such that we can measure those outcomes. Having said that, it is true that we have been advocating in many of these countries that the level of taxation needs to be higher, for a very simple reason. If you look at around the world and countries that are in fragile situations, there's always a common thread, and that common thread is that if a country doesn't get at least 15% of GDP of government revenues, at the end of the day, it's not viable. And so some of the countries, Guatemala being a good example, are below that number. And so if you are to deliver the kind of public goods a society of today needs, if you want to try to really push the dial on innovation and be a modern economy, you have to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you put the burden on few. And there's a lot to be said in terms of efficiency on taxation, and there's a lot to be done in terms of how you bring around this process. You cannot shock an economy and do it from one day to the next. Equally, I think it's a sense of the US Congress, for the reasons I outlined earlier, that they don't want the US taxpayer to carry all the burden. So they want to see some skin in the game, to put it in very plain language.
Great. Well, thank you, President Moreno. I'm so grateful you took the time to be with us as we celebrate our 50th anniversary as an organization and collaborate with you at the bank, not only on the alliance issues, but also on the Summit of the Americas. I think taking on thematically the rule of law and anti-corruption, there's a big wave of public-private partnership prospects that we together can actually be highlighting, bringing these countries, this hemispheric investment opportunities to bear. But it takes partnerships. It takes two to tango. And I'd say that you are an absolutely great partner to dance with, and we look forward to doing that from some time here forward.
I'm always ready to tango or salsa or whatever you want. Thank
Great.
you all very much.
I'll take you up.
Thank you, President Moreno, and thank you, Jody. The long-standing partnership that the IDB has had with AACCLA, I think, is something that not only transcends, in specific areas like trade facilitation, but on the rule of law in other areas. It's been something that's been long-standing. Something that Jody certainly talked about is the issues in Colombia, and I think there's clearly a number of those issues, but it's also a place that we from the private sector have looked at Colombia for a long time as one of those shining examples in the region of areas not only in free trade but in rule of law. And so our next panel is going to speak specifically about what Colombia means, not only to the region, but what it's meant to our bilateral relationship. And so it is my privilege and my honor to invite my colleague, Isabel Quiros, to the stage, as well as her panelists, to talk specifically about Colombia and the opportunities that we see in that market. Isabel?
We'll be joined by our other panelists in just a minute. We're not just sitting far from each other right now. Aquí. No, ay, perdón. No, sí, sí. Well, we're coming up to the end of the conference, and we're still waiting on our one more panelist. But I do appreciate everybody being here and to really talk about an important conversation with our distinguished guests, and especially speaking right after President Luis Alberto Moreno and Jody Hanson-Bond, and talking about what's going on for next year in the summit, what's going on with corruption, and really what's going on in the hemisphere. This year has been instrumental for Colombia, for the hemisphere. A year ago, Colombia had taken steps to develop, to step away from a time, from an era. And this year has been the 5th year for a free trade agreement with Colombia. This only is a testament of what the US, what Colombia, private sector and government is really trying to do. The US Chamber this year launched the US-Colombia Business Council. And again, only strengthening that partnership, only strengthening the businesses, and really working to support the two communities. And I'm very pleased to have this conversation on Colombia Forging a New Era with Sergio, Silvana, and Nathan. What you may not know, with what the bio is not mentioned, is that Sergio here is not only the head of the agency, he's also the acting mayor of Cartagena. So we have an official here that has a lot going on, but we appreciate you taking the time to be here. And with that, we would love to hear a little bit more about the agency, about the work that's going on, and really how can we partner with you?
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Silvana, Nathan. Well, yes, two jobs at once, they're a handful, but it's been quite a fortunate week. We've been at UNGA with the president, and now in DC, and it's obviously a real pleasure to be with you. Well, the agency for the Presidential Agency for Cooperation is basically an agency that had in the past only received international aid as we know it from donor countries. It has done obviously as well South-South cooperation with other countries similar to Colombia in the developing world. But with the peace agreement, a new handful of opportunities arose. And the president, when he appointed me in February of this year, he challenged me into working with the private sector, because he was told once and again by CEOs and by officials that we want to help. We want to be with Colombia in their growth in that new era of peace. And the opportunities of peace, as President Santos says, are endless in the territories. So he told the agency, how can international philanthropy, how can business partners really go into the territories and help? And the agency, that's what we're doing. We're aligning the work that the private sector can do with the Sustainable Development Goals, which Colombia has championed through this year's at the UN era, the UN summits. And we have also been aligning it with international cooperation as we know it, and development aid. So we have 4 funds, with the one at the United Nations, the EU fund, the Inter-American Development Bank fund, which is Colombia Sostenible, the environmental. Luis Alberto Moreno, the president of IDB, has just spoke about what he's doing in the hemisphere. And in Colombia, that's very important. And the World Bank Fund. And obviously, all the bilateral funds that come with it. So what we're trying to do is taking the best of all of these worlds and integrating them into the implementation process of Colombia. And for those who don't know, maybe many of you were here last year when we were with the president, is that the implementation plan in Colombia, which is heavily supported by USAID and the Department of State and all the US agencies on the ground, is a plan for 15 years. So we have a lot of work to do still, and we're basically championing that end of the bargain. So, and in Cartagena, well, it's a city of 1 million inhabitants, and what we're doing there is we're trying to. Cartagena is not in the post-conflict scenario, but it has received a lot of displaced people throughout the years. So we're channeling international aid also towards giving those people another opportunity. So.
Thank you. You definitely have your plate full right now. A lot of projects within the country and also in the city. We're also joined by Silvana, who is leading global partnerships at Department of State. She's been over 10 years as a US diplomat, serving all over the world, including Colombia. And small fact on her is that her parents are Colombian, just like mine. We are trying to figure out if we're related in some sort of way, but we haven't decided yet. The verdict's still out. But with that, we would love to hear a little bit more about how the State Department is working on a global level on partnerships and differentiation of Colombia.
Sure, thank you, Isabel. So the office that I work in is called the Secretary's Office of Global Partnerships. And so this is an office that was launched in 2008, and it sees itself as one of the main entry points for the private sector that's looking to get engaged and involved in what the State Department is doing. And so our office really has two value propositions. One of them is to engage the private sector in order to advance the Secretary of State's priorities, and that completely depends on every new secretary that comes in. We're largely agnostic on issues, but our focus and our lens is really on engaging the private sector. And the second thing that we do is really try to institutionalize this idea of collaborating with the private sector by providing consulting and advisory services with different offices throughout the Department of State. There's like, a huge presence all over the world. So, sometimes people ask me, well, what does partnerships mean to you? It could look like a lot of different things. I think it might be most instructive to say what partnerships are not. And the first thing I'll say is I'm not talking about a traditional grant structure. If that's the kind of thing you're interested in, I might point you more towards USAID. They do a lot in the world of public-private partnerships, but they also have this sort of a scale of budgets that lends itself more towards more traditional grant-making structure. I would also say that we don't look at the private sector as an ATM, and I think that it's really important to underscore that point. So what we try to do is really think about partnerships in a very, very new way. And so when I say private sector, I think it's also important to underscore that it's not just companies and it's not just your startups, it's also your foundations, your NGOs, your incubators, your accelerators, your think tanks, academia. I mean, we're thinking large, and we're thinking mostly about the fact that you have to recognize the value that each partner can bring to the table. So in thinking about these things, I think it's important to point out a couple of things about the changing landscape. The first thing is that, if you look at a statistic, I think in 1969, 70% of US resource flows to the developing world were in the form of official development assistance, or aid. Today, that's flip-flopped, and I think around 90% of what goes to the developing world in terms of US resource flows is really private capital. So especially in this era that we're in now, where our government budgets are shrinking, and we all know that that's the reality, I think this concept of partnerships is even more important, and so that all of us in the government and in every sector should really think about how we can sort of leverage what each other is doing. So the second thing that I want to underscore is this idea of recognizing the value that each partner can bring to the table. So we, in our office, see that the private sector has a lot to bring beyond the financial side. Sometimes you'll have a partnership that's a monetary partnership, but often in what we do, it's not monetary. It's trying to capitalize on things that the private sector can bring, like supply chain, presence on the ground, ability to advertise, technical skills, knowledge, networks, relationships, you name it. I could go on forever. The list is very long. I would also like to underscore, as a government employee, that I think the government has a lot to bring to the table as well, that the private sector would be very well advised to remember that we can bring things like certain types of legitimacy, we can bring our own networks and relationships, we can bring policy influence and convening power, knowledge on the ground as well. And again, the list goes on and on. So when I think about an example of a partnership that could be interesting, this is just a small example from the region that we worked on, but we've been running for several years these camps called YSci, which is Women in Science. And the idea is basically you're trying to encourage young women to get involved in science, technology, engineering. And so we partnered with entities like Google and Intel and the UN Foundation. And we basically all pitched in to try to create these camps where you're pulling girls in from countries across the regions to really study science and technology. So for example, what did we do? What did we bring to the table? The convening and organizing power, the cultivating of the partnership, the management of it. What do our embassies overseas bring? They help us select these women. They help us ensure that they have their visas. They help, when we send in materials for these camps, they help make sure that they get through the customs process without having to pay the fees and things like that. And our private sector partners like Google and Intel were doing things like actually sending the trainers to run the camps. And so, you know, when I think about what our private sector partners got out of us, it was a sort of an investment for them in workforce development in the future. It was access to new markets. It was also morale building for some of their employees. It was branding and reputation. And obviously for us, you know, these issues are near and dear to our hearts, so we were very enthused about the idea of these young women growing into this field. So that's just an example where you don't necessarily need to bring all this money to the table, but that you each have resources that you can give. And I have a number of examples like that that we've been doing, like for example in Mexico, providing seed funding for a partnership with Discovery Channel to do public service announcements to get young women involved, again in engineering and technology. So the idea is sort of trying to step back, think outside of the box about how you can partner and bring different resources that are not just money to the table. When people ask me, how do you get involved with the State Department in terms of these kinds of partnerships, I would say that there's no cookie cutter approach, and we were just talking about this outside, that often partnerships are very organic. It's who you've been talking to at a conference, it's that drink you had with a person, it's the person you met in a meeting. And starting those kind of ideating conversations to get to the point where you can build a partnership. If you're here in Washington, D.C., a very good place to start in terms of the State Department would be our office. I'm happy to give you my card and our email, or the country desk of the country you're looking to get involved in the region. If you're in Colombia, for example, starting at the embassy, maybe the economic section, these are good entryway points. But the reality is, in everything that I've seen, the more people you can talk to early in the idea of developing this concept, the better. For example, consulting with the Colombian government. What are their priorities? And being really strategic about thinking about, okay, what's in it for each of the partners? We all have our different objectives, and we should be very, very cold and clear about that. But the point is that we can still have shared goals and talk about how we can get there. So I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards or give you, again, direction for how to contact our office.
Thank you so much, Silvana. I'm sure a lot of our AmChams are going to contact you because that is something that they enjoy doing. They want to partner, they want to develop their countries, they want to make sure they find a way to really be able to partner properly. And of course, our companies are doing the same. And now I would really like to invite Nathan to share a couple of comments. Nathan oversees he's the director at TDA, the Trade Development Agency, and he leads all our work going on in Latin America and the region. And in particular, I'm back on, okay. I understand that USTDA picks priority countries, and Colombia is currently a priority country, and right now there are projects going on. There are already things being developed, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about what is going on with USTDA in Colombia.
Sure. All right, well, thank you for the invitation, and sorry that I'm using my high school yearbook photo for the picture. I have to update that. So. USTDA is basically all about creating partnerships for infrastructure projects in partner countries. Basically what we do is we provide early project planning tools in the form of grants for feasibility studies and technical assistance and pilot projects for major infrastructure projects, mainly in the transportation, energy, and IT sectors. And Colombia has been, one of our star partners for many years, and we've had, great successes in many sectors. Just to name a few, port projects that we've done at the Port of Cartagena, gas treatment projects with Ecopetrol, airport projects that we've done with Aerocivil, and we have new projects underway with UTME and Celsia, and just finished a project with the airport of Barranquilla. Just a number of projects across sectors that have been quite successful. What we do is we provide the funding for actually conducting the feasibility studies, but our host country project sponsors are the ones that select the firms that are best qualified to do the work, and then our agency pays for those services. And for us, basically we look at three factors for deciding what projects we can support. First, it has to be a high priority development project for the host country. Second, it has to be a project that has a good potential for being able to obtain implementation financing. And third, it has to be a project that has a potential for mutual benefit, commercial benefit. So transportation, IT, energy have been particularly good markets for us. And also we can work with both the private and public sector. So in Colombia, we have done projects with at the ministerial level, also with federal government entities such as DIAN. We've done projects with various departments, municipalities, and a number of private sector concessionaires. So the range is pretty open in that regard. And our process is quite simple. I mean, it's a matter of contacting me. I cover the entire region, have a country manager who's responsible for Colombia. We have sub-regional country managers for each area of the hemisphere. And it's just a matter of contacting us and give us your project concept, and we see how we can develop it from there. But yeah, Colombia in particular has been a great success for us. Another thing I wanted to mention is we launched an initiative a couple of years ago for which Colombia was a star participant as well, which we call our Global Procurement Initiative. And basically this came about as a result of conversations over many years with US companies who would tell us that, hey, we bid on projects all the time where we lose because the procurement decisions are based on lowest cost. And sometimes US technologies may not be the lowest cost. But when you take into account the entire life cycle cost of ownership of that, whatever that thing is that you're procuring, you may come up with a whole different calculation as to what is the best investment. And US companies usually come out quite well when you're looking at things based on best value rather than lowest cost. So the Global Procurement Initiative is something we've now executed with Colombia and Panama. We're about to launch it in Brazil, Mexico, so that's a good example of something that also I think is beneficial both for our partners in Colombia and also for US companies in the audience.
Well, I do want to take audience questions, and while the mics go around, I did want to ask something that all three of you have been mentioning, and is the partnerships that you're doing and getting involved. But let's take a step back. How do we get our companies involved in the planning process? How is it that we can get, before it even becomes that project, before they can even bid on that? Is there a roundtable? Is there a possibility to get them involved in the even earlier stages than what it is just to bid on the project?
What we've been doing in these past months, and I think Silvana would agree, is that, as she was saying and we were discussing, there's no sure way of entering a process. What we encourage is that everything we do is tailor-made for companies. So we take possible projects that our are in our national development plan or in our peace implementation plan, and we figure out which processes, which projects are defunded or need international review or subject or susceptible to receiving any kind of out-of-the-box cooperation. And we just do a roundtable with a company, a set of companies, or a chamber of commerce, for example, and try to figure out what the countries need or are interested. Because Silvana said something that is the key to the business, is we need to understand that each and every one of us has objectives to fulfill. So if we can share those thoughts in a roundtable and get out these initiatives and take them into projects, we would sure have solid ground to base our future cooperation. So I think is just approach government with your ideas, or with your desires, with your objectives, and with us and with your government and with your Chamber of Commerce, we're going to work it out to see what we can do. We have just one initiative that I would like to highlight. It's called Peace Forests. In Espanol, it's Bosques de Paz. And what we're doing with Bosques de Paz is that it's an integral conservation initiative, reforestation, protection of water systems in a region, but it's also a peace-building initiative, because people who were affected by conflict now have productive projects around these peace forests for them not to go and kill trees or eliminate trees or promote deforestation. But also they become park rangers. And it is also, in peace forests, there's also a memory building component. So we're doing with extractives a lot of peace forests, because their compensation resources can help us out in building those peace forests. So we basically just come to us, or we go to you, and we tailor-made your desires and the objectives.
Perfect. I mean, I guess I would reiterate that point, that there is no one approach. The kinds of partnerships that we're talking about are usually not in response to a bid or anything like that. They're usually something that are created organically because there's a need to be filled. And so part of that is thinking about what goal you have, and then try to figure out how you pull in people who might have a shared goal, maybe different interests sort of involved in there, but sort of want to get to the same point, and then start talking, start meeting. I think roundtables are a great tool. There are a lot of other tools that you can use out there. You can sit down with partners and use design thinking tools. You can think about challenges and hackathons and all sorts of different ways to try to start pulling in partners, identify people you want to work with, and get to propose solutions. But to me, it's not so much in response to a bid, but it's more in response to a good idea. And so I think that would really be the way I would start approaching things.
Right. I think that first, one way to get involved in the planning process is when we have an ongoing feasibility study, I would recommend to companies in particular to, if you see a project that you're interested in that we're doing, contact the firm that is carrying out the study, and first just ask them, how it's going, what they think the prospects are, et cetera, but also let them know what your company does and see if it's a match for the study. And I would, as a chapter in the study is typically U.S. sources of supply, so that the project sponsor will have that as a resource once the study's done and they're looking to implement. You have it be included in there as one of the potential suppliers for that type of project. Also, we have a library full of completed studies, and I would encourage firms to take a look at our library collection and see if there are projects there that are ones that are in your sector. In addition to the studies, we also fund reverse trade missions to the United States. So we bring host country project sponsors that have a project that they're seeking to develop, and we do customized tours where we bring them to the U.S. for site visits, for visits with companies, visits with government counterparts, with financiers, et cetera. And I would encourage companies to certainly get involved in those visits. Quite often we have business briefings associated with those visits as well. And that's another way to get involved. And if you have a good location for a site visit that matches up with what the delegates are interested in, then we can arrange that as well. So those are probably the best ways to engage, and I'd be happy to circulate. We have a biweekly alert that tells you about all the upcoming events that we're hosting so that you can get plugged into those.
Well, we'd definitely love to get involved. Do I have any questions from the audience?
Hi. My name is Catherine, or people call me Kit Yessi, and I'm with an organization called Education Development Center, EDC. Taking it from the other perspective, so we work in education and heavily in workforce development among youth all over the world. And I, for several years, was overseeing our projects throughout Latin America, some of them in Colombia, in Chocó, in Quibdó, working in education. And I was approached by many ministries of education and private sector representatives saying, our biggest problem really is English. We don't have enough teachers, we can't have computers in every school, we don't even have electricity a lot of the time. Can you do what you've done in other countries? We reach about 45 million students in the world with English programs using something called interactive audio instruction, which is sort of an audio program that schools can use anywhere. We use wind-up radios at times. We use rechargeable speakers, little MP3 players, so you're not dependent on electricity. So it's a good idea, and it has years and years of results. I decided to go ahead and produce them, integrate the work readiness programs into them. I got Colombian pop stars to sing the reggaeton that taught greetings. I got education experts in English to help with the curriculum. It works. Now, when I go to do a public-private partnership with the private sector, and I engage the public sector, my biggest problem is the following, and I'd like to know if you all could help address this. So we've already implemented, with support from the IDB and other places in Dominican Republic, in Honduras, in Colombia, but the biggest problem is time. It's these schedules. It's very easy for me to convince a minister and show them results, and they say, oh, $2 or $3 a year for our students, perfect, Same thing with the private sector. They understand they need it for tourism, they need it for call centers, they need it for so many of their business needs, and that's what they bring to it. They bring the work experience. The problem is scheduling. By the time you kind of get through the bureaucracy of the public sector, or you wait for the board of directors to meet with the private sector, those schedules never coincide. And so that's the biggest hurdle I've found over the past, say, 10 years. So I'm wondering if you could address that issue of time and give me any suggestions as to how that could be addressed.
In our case, of course we've seen that, and it was one of the barriers in the partnerships. And what we are doing is that the agency has an area just dedicated to coordinating institutions inside our government and with local governments. And while it's rough on the edges still, what we're doing is that we're trying to put a more heavy thought on trying to impulse these links between government in order for them to work a lot faster. And an example is what we're doing with ProColombia and the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of the Environment, is that we're linking the APC to ProColombia in order for when ProColombia goes out into the world, it can talk about corporate social responsibility in programs that we're into. And when a new company arrives and wishes to do an investment in Colombia, all of the social part, we try to lobby it, and all of the investment part, ProColombia tries to lobby it. So we're basically partnering between each agency in order for things to move faster. So we've definitely been approaching that. We still have a lot of road ahead, but we're doing it. And now that I'm in the territorial level in Colombia, what we're doing is that, and we were speaking about that with Silvana as well, you need to create a focus on institutions in these development plans. And that's another thing that we're channeling funds to. Because without institutions, without strong institutions in the territories, we won't be able to accomplish the things we want to accomplish. So that's two main focus of the cooperation world that you have just addressed. And we're heavily working on it to get results. And if I want your card, because I'm very interested for Cartagena.
I would say I think that's one of the inherent difficulties about partnerships that you've identified. And the reality is, if I had the solution for how to make the U.S. government work faster, I would be a very rich woman indeed, I think. But I think what's difficult is, you're right, every partner is going to have their own sort of imperatives schedule-wise, in terms of budget cycles, in terms of upcoming elections, in terms of presentations to the board, whatever. And that's, I think, always going to be difficult. Some of the best partnerships that we've seen and worked on were honestly ones that sort of took their time to create, to sort of build up the partnership in a very strong way. And I think it's hard, but I think that investment up front hopefully means you're going to have more impact and a lasting partnership. But it is very, very difficult. And one of the reasons I think that we see both sort of the nonprofit space and the private sector space as really valuable partners is because they do have a lot more flexibility than sometimes we do for things to move a little faster. So I think often that's why you will see in these partnerships, for example, the nonprofit sort of really doing the management side of the partnership, because they can just run with it so much faster than we can. I don't think that's a solution, but I empathize with what you're saying.
Thank you all for your commentary. And one of the things that I noticed from each of your comments is that you have very different frameworks for how you structure your partnerships or your private sector engagement. One of the things that we're looking at as a U.S. Columbia Business Council is how to enhance those partnership connections. So I'm curious if you have a series of best practices or suggestions for how we might work better with your offices to engage in the opportunities that you're articulating.
Well, for us, for example, I think I've sort of maybe identified some of the most important points. The biggest first step is just reaching out. Human connection goes so far. So come in, talk about it, say, these are some of my ideas, how can I get there? We are a very receptive audience to that kind of thing. And our role really is about connecting people, cultivating relationships. So we're very happy to say, okay, given what you're telling us, here are 10 different places we think you can go. These are some ideas for how to structure it. And that would be a good way to go through our office.
Just the same as in our case, but also just a map of the companies, of the interests of the companies would work out for us very much, because what we try to do is we try to map them out in the office, and we try to give you projects as well in order for that idea creation, projects that are aligned with our national development plan, in order for us to go into territory with you and tell you, well, sustainability, the SDGs in this area are in some percent. If you do this and this investment, or if your social responsibility funds go into this, or if we partner with Microsoft and do white space technology in a school in a rural area, then we will advance in SDGs by X%. So we also try to give you projects that can advance you and your not only your business goals, but also your social development goals as created by the UN, thinking about the whole holistic approach of the development plans in the world right now. So give us a map of companies, and we would be glad to work out with you in those projects.
And for USTDA, we be happy to share information on all of our upcoming activities. A lot of the things that we have are things that have the predetermined shelf life. They're things that have to happen quickly, be turned around quickly. So we want to get the information out to as many people as quickly as possible. So we'd be delighted to do that. Also, we would always, when you have members that have ideas of projects or opportunities that they see that where we could be of help, please contact us. We're always happy to brainstorm. A lot of our best ideas come from the chambers and from AmChams, et cetera. So we're always happy to explore new ideas.
Thank you. And actually, on the projects for USTDA, not focusing just on Colombia, but the other projects in the hemisphere, approximately how much is being invested in the region? Do you by any chance know?
Well, I guess percentage-wise is probably about, I don't know, 20% of our total portfolio in terms of number of projects. And yeah, our fiscal year ends in a couple of weeks. I'll have a better idea of that very soon. We're running around closing deals right now, actually. But yeah, it's about 20% of our overall portfolio.
And in what countries or region? In Central America, Southern Cone?
Yeah, it's spread throughout. Brazil has been our biggest country of investment, but we just opened in Argentina this year. So Argentina is a place where we're now seeing a lot of new engagement after many years of not having been engaged. But yeah, Colombia also every year has been a very steady partner, but also Panama, Mexico, Dominican Republic have been, I'd say, the main ones. And we do a number of regional activities as well, where we try to get in as many partner countries as possible.
No, I think that this is a very important conversation to have, especially as we're trying to understand how to work together, how our companies can really further develop this partnership and really see how we can help, how the private sector, our AmChams, can really help with the government in these initiatives and these projects. And we hope that you're able to look towards our AmChams, to look towards our business council, to look to our companies for that support. Right now that you're mentioning all of the companies, I know plenty of them who would want to sign up. And when you're talking about all the events that you are publishing, all of our AmChams also want to participate in these. And again, on a global level, not only it's in our hemisphere, but it's around the world that we also have these chambers, and we really do hope to be able to partner around the world. And with that, I really want to thank all of you for participating, unless we have any other questions.
Can I say one last thing about the region? We also work in Central America and the Caribbean, of course, in Africa as well. But in the Caribbean and in Central America, we're doing sustainable farming projects. We're doing early childhood development in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And there we're working with USAID and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their cooperation agencies. We're doing security issues in Central America. We're doing yucca in Jamaica and in other two islands in the Caribbean. So what we're saying is that if you want, with the European Union, we're doing the project of yucca in the Caribbean. So if you really want to get into the region and do other sustainable development projects, we're here for you. We've been in the region as well for quite a while, and that's a part of our South-South cooperation strategy. So also we can take partnerships to that level as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. I am sure many people didn't know that Colombia was also looking out as well. But again, thank you so much for your participation. We appreciate your words and your time, and please give us your contact information, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to reach out to you. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And can I get an extra round of applause for Isabel Quiroz? That was the first time she's moderated a panel here at AACCLA. Congratulations. I want to thank all of you. Colombia has long been a proud partner. It's something that we've been focusing on for nearly half a decade, obviously following on the FTA. So this is extremely helpful for all of us. We look forward to working with all of you moving forward. So thank you very much. And it's now my privilege to invite our Executive Vice President of AACCLA, Mr. Neil Harrington. He was on fire last night, so we'll see how he does this evening with some closing remarks. So Mr. Harrington, I'd like to invite you to close our session. Thank you so much. You have to use the stairs. No jumping. No jumping. No jumping.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm waiting for Ruben to load the 100-slide PowerPoint. No? No? No. Oops, I mean to take that. Okay, seriously, I'm an AACCLA baby when it comes to being compared to with a lot of folks who have with a lot of history in this organization. But did this conference, or did it not really represent what this organization is about? I think it really, thank you. I think it embodied what this organization has been about for 50 years, and that is getting thought leaders and policymakers in a room with our indomitable AmChams and having discussions about the most pressing issues of the day and coming out with tangible ideas about how we press forward. With that, I want to thank Ambassador Carla Hills, President Moreno, our government and corporate panelists, our terrific chamber team, who, beyond the AACCLA team, the work that we all know that Ruben and Isa drive for all of us. Jody presenting the survey, Kendra moderating rule of law, a rule of law discussion that was incredibly engaging and I think educational for all of us. I also don't want to reprise my Emmy speech of last night, but the leadership transition is crucial. We're thrilled about it. We really appreciate the wonderful work that Tom Kenna did for us this past year, and are most certainly looking forward to the great leadership of Jose Antonio Munoz going forward. I think the real work, so we went through the survey. We all know what the issues are. We all had a great discussion about NAFTA, Venezuela, rule of law, trade, customs, trade facilitation, et cetera, are going to be the focus for us. And our next 50 years starts literally tomorrow. I mean, it really does. When Jody, Ruben, Nate, and the team go to Ottawa, it's something that, yes, it's the 3 NAFTA countries, but it's something that's going to impact this whole region, as we've talked about this week. And I think that we are very excited to have our leadership circle companies engaged. We really, once again, appreciate your enduring support. And for the rest of you, we'll see everyone in Miami. But I think we'll be having discussions a lot sooner than that, given the pressing issues in our region. Thank you again for your attendance for these 3 days. Looking forward to seeing you in Florida in February. Thank you.